The mist rises from the Somerset levels on a cold winter morning, revealing landscape features that have remained essentially unchanged for thousands of years. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Phone face down, volume at a whisper. Let's dive in. The physical evidence for understanding the religious practitioners who operated across the British landscape during the final centuries before Roman conquest remains frustratingly sparse and fragmentary, consisting primarily of archaeological materials that cannot speak directly to the belief systems and ritual practices they once served. The absence of written records produced by these religious specialists themselves means that reconstructing their activities requires careful interpretation of material remains, imported classical accounts written by hostile observers, and the challenging work of disentangling later mythological elaborations from genuine historical memory. The term Druid itself derives from ancient Celtic linguistic roots, with the prefix dru likely related to words meaning oak or firm, combined with wid, meaning knowledge or wisdom, suggesting these figures functioned as possessors of deep knowledge within their societies. The linguistic evidence indicates that similar religious specialists operated across the Celtic-speaking regions of continental Europe and the British Isles, though regional variations in practice and belief almost certainly existed across this vast geographical area. The British landscape during the Late Iron Age, spanning roughly from the 8th century before the Common Era through the 1st century of the Common Era, supported numerous distinct tribal groups whose material cultures show both local distinctiveness and evidence of extensive contact networks connecting communities across southern England with continental European populations. Archaeological excavations at hill forts, ritual sites, and settlement locations have revealed sophisticated societies with advanced metalworking capabilities, agricultural systems capable of supporting substantial populations, and social structures that included warrior elites, skilled craftspeople, and presumably the religious specialists who would later be identified in classical sources as Druids. The physical infrastructure supporting religious activities during this period included both natural landscape features that were apparently invested with sacred significance and deliberately constructed monuments that required substantial, communal labor and sophisticated astronomical knowledge to plan and build. Excavations at sites like Cadbury Castle in Somerset have revealed evidence for communal feasting activities that may have had religious dimensions, while the continuing use and modification of much older Neolithic monuments like Stonehenge and Avebury suggests these ancient sites retained sacred significance for Iron Age populations, despite their construction millennia earlier. The Lindo Man discovery in 1984, when peat cutters working in a bog near Manchester uncovered remarkably preserved human remains dating to the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era, provided extraordinary physical evidence for Iron Age ritual practices that may have involved Druids or other religious specialists. The forensic examination of these remains revealed details that correspond remarkably well with classical accounts of Druidic human sacrifice, including evidence for a threefold death involving blunt force trauma to the head, strangulation by a cord tied around the neck, and throat cutting, followed by deposition in a bog that had likely been considered sacred. The preservation of stomach contents revealed his final meal included a preparation made from multiple grain species, possibly a ritual food, while the absence of defensive wounds and evidence suggesting he had been a relatively high-status individual based on his physical condition and grooming raised questions about whether this represented voluntary sacrifice, execution for religious or political reasons. The discovery of other bog bodies from various locations across northern Europe, many showing similar evidence of violent death and ritual deposition, suggests these practices formed part of a broader religious tradition operating across Celtic and Germanic cultural regions during the Late Iron Age and early Roman periods. The classical Mediterranean sources that provide the earliest textual references to Druids must be approached with careful attention to the political and cultural contexts in which these authors worked, recognizing that they wrote from outsider perspectives shaped by Greek and Roman assumptions about civilization and barbarism. Julius Caesar's accounts of Druids in his commentaries on the Gallic War, composed during the 50s, before the Common Era, as both military reports and political propaganda, designed to justify his campaigns and enhance his reputation in Rome, provide the most detailed classical description of Druidic functions and organization. Caesar described Druids as forming a distinct social class within Celtic societies, responsible for conducting sacrifices, interpreting religious matters, educating noble youth, and serving as judges in disputes between individuals and tribes. His accounts emphasized their role in preserving traditional knowledge through oral transmission, claiming they memorized vast quantities of verse rather than committing their learning to writing, despite being familiar with Greek letters for other purposes. The reasons Caesar attributes for this oral tradition included both religious prohibition and the practical desire to prevent their doctrines from becoming public knowledge, while also ensuring students developed powerful memories through the discipline of memorization. Caesar's description of Druidic education claimed young men spent up to 20 years studying with these teachers, learning not only religious lore, but also knowledge concerning the natural world, astronomy, and theology. His account emphasized beliefs in the transmigration of souls after death, claiming Druids taught that the soul passed from one body to another rather than perishing, a doctrine he compared to Pythagorean philosophy and suggested served to encourage military courage by removing fear of death. The political dimensions of Druidic functions received significant attention in Caesar's account, which described them as wielding considerable authority through their ability to exclude individuals from sacrifices, a punishment that effectively made the victim an outcast, whom others refused to associate with for fear of contagion. Caesar claimed Druids gathered annually at a sacred location in the territory of the Carnutes tribe in central Gaul, considered the center of all Gaul, where they adjudicated disputes and maintained the unified structure of their order across tribal boundaries. His account described their organization as including a single leader elected from among their number based on merit, a position held for life unless a candidate of exceptional distinction emerged, in which case selection might involve armed conflict between competing factions. The military intelligence value of understanding Druidic authority structures and religious beliefs becomes apparent when considering Caesar's strategic objectives in Gaul, as he recognized that undermining or co-opting these religious leaders could facilitate Roman control over Celtic populations who regarded Druidic pronouncements as authoritative. The specific claims Caesar made about Druidic human sacrifice, including the construction of massive wicker figures filled with living people and set ablaze as offerings to the gods, have provoked scholarly debate about whether these accounts reflect actual practices, represent misunderstandings of Celtic rituals, or constitute deliberate propaganda designed to portray Celtic societies as barbaric and thus justify Roman conquest. Archaeological evidence for human sacrifice in Celtic contexts exists, including the bog body discoveries and various examples of unusual burials showing evidence of violent death and ritual treatment, but the specific details of Caesar's Wicker Man description remain unverified by material evidence and may represent an elaboration based on partial information or deliberate exaggeration. The Greek geographer Strabo, writing during the late 1st century before the Common Era and early 1st century of the Common Era, provided additional classical perspectives on Druids that both corroborate and complicate Caesar's accounts. Strabo described 3 classes of respected men among the Celts, including Druids as philosophers and theologians, Vates as diviners and natural philosophers, and bards as singers and poets, suggesting a more complex religious and intellectual hierarchy than Caesar's simpler descriptions. His accounts of human sacrifice included claims that Druids would stab victims in the back and divine the future from their death convulsions, or shoot them down with arrows, or impale them in temples, methods that differ from Caesar's descriptions and suggest either regional variation in practices or confused amalgamation of different reports. The methodological challenges of relying on classical sources for understanding Druids include not only their hostile external perspectives and political motivations, but also their tendency to interpret Celtic religious practices through Greek and Roman philosophical and theological categories that may have distorted the actual nature of indigenous beliefs. The classical authors' frequent comparisons between Druids and Greek philosophers, including specific parallels drawn with Pythagorean teachings about metempsychosis, may tell us more about how educated Romans and Greeks understood their own philosophical traditions than about actual Druidic doctrines. The question of whether Druids possessed genuine astronomical knowledge, sophisticated enough to construct sites like Stonehenge, or merely preserve traditional lore about the movements of celestial bodies useful for calendrical purposes, cannot be resolved through classical sources alone, but requires careful analysis of archaeological evidence from ritual sites. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder, writing during the 1st century of the Common Era, provided detailed descriptions of Druidic ritual practices involving sacred plants, particularly their veneration of oak trees and mistletoe. His famous account of the mistletoe ceremony described Druids cutting the plant from oak trees using golden sickles while dressed in white robes, conducting the ritual on the 6th day after the new moon, when the plant's magical properties were believed to be strongest. Pliny's description emphasized the rarity and sacred significance of mistletoe growing on oak trees specifically, as the plant more commonly grew on other species, and claimed Druids believed it had been placed there by the gods themselves. The ritual following the mistletoe harvest, according to Pliny's account, involved sacrificing 2 white bulls, while participants consumed ritual drinks made from the plant, which was credited with properties including curing infertility in animals and serving as an antidote to all poisons. These accounts of plant-focused rituals align with broader patterns in ancient religious practices across various cultures that invested particular plants with sacred significance based on their unusual characteristics, medicinal properties, or perceived connections to divine powers. The archaeological evidence for ritual activity involving plant materials remains challenging to interpret due to preservation issues, as organic materials typically decay completely in most soil conditions, though pollen analysis and waterlogged deposits at some sites have provided evidence for the use of particular plant species in ritual contexts. The Roman poet Lucan, writing during the 1st century of the Common Era, provided some of the most vivid and disturbing imagery associated with Druids in his descriptions of sacred groves filled with dark pools, crude altars, and trees splattered with human blood. His accounts emphasized the alien and frightening nature of these sacred spaces from a Roman perspective, describing them as places where even birds refused to perch and animals avoided, where strange sounds emanated and supernatural presences could be felt by those who entered. The Roman conquest of Britain, initiated by the Emperor Claudius in 43 of the Common Era, brought classical military power into direct conflict with indigenous British populations and their religious leadership, creating conditions that would fundamentally alter the practice and transmission of Druidic traditions. The initial invasion focused on the southeast of Britain, where several tribal groups, including the Catuvelauni and Trinovantes, controlled rich agricultural territories and maintained political structures that Roman strategists believed could be either conquered militarily or co-opted. Through diplomatic pressure and the installation of client rulers, the Roman advance proceeded systematically through the establishment of fortified positions, road construction connecting these military installations, and the projection of force against resistant tribal groups, while attempting to secure the cooperation of local elites who might benefit from alignment with Roman power. The resistance organized by Caratacus, a leader of the Catuvelauni tribe who continued fighting Roman forces for nearly a decade after the initial invasion, demonstrated both the military capabilities of British tribal confederations and the challenges Roman commanders faced in pacifying territories where the population remained hostile and the terrain favored defensive warfare and guerrilla tactics. The eventual capture of Caratacus in 51 of the Common Era, following his defeat in a set-piece battle and subsequent betrayal by Cartimandua, the queen of the Brigantes tribe who maintained alliance with Rome, eliminated one focus of organized resistance but did not end British opposition to Roman conquest. The specific role Druids played in organizing or encouraging resistance to Roman invasion remains uncertain due to the limited sources, but classical accounts consistently portrayed them as hostile to Roman authority and influential in maintaining traditional Celtic identity and religious practices that conflicted with Roman cultural and political dominance. The Roman advance into Wales during the 50s of the Common Era brought imperial forces into direct confrontation with what classical sources described as a major centre of Druidic activity and resistance on the island of Anglesey, known to the Romans as Mona. The Roman historian Tacitus, whose father-in-law Agricola had served as a military commander in Britain, provided a detailed account of the Roman assault on Anglesey in 60 or 61 of the Common Era, describing the scene that confronted Roman soldiers as they prepared to cross the Menai Strait. His account depicted ranks of armed warriors defending the shore, while Druids raised their hands to the heavens, uttering terrible curses, and women dressed in black ran between the ranks like furies carrying torches and screaming, imprecations against the invaders. The psychological impact of this scene reportedly caused Roman soldiers to freeze momentarily before their commanders urged them forward, and they launched their assault, eventually overwhelming the defenders and burning the sacred groves that Tacitus claimed were devoted to savage superstitions, including human sacrifice. The destruction of the Druidic centre on Anglesey represented a deliberate strategy to eliminate a source of religious authority that sanctioned resistance and provided ideological justification for continued opposition to Roman rule. The timing of the Anglesey assault proved unfortunate for Roman strategic objectives, as it coincided with the outbreak of the Boudiccan revolt in 60 or 61 of the Common Era, when Boudica, queen of the Iceni tribe, led a massive uprising that destroyed the Roman settlements at Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium, killing thousands of Roman colonists and collaborating Britons before eventually being defeated in a climactic battle. The Boudiccan revolt demonstrated the fragility of Roman control over Britain during the early conquest period, and suggested that resentment against Roman taxation, land confiscation, and cultural domination ran deep among significant portions of the British population. The process of Romanization that gradually transformed British society over the centuries following the initial conquest created complex dynamics whereby traditional Celtic cultural practices, including religious beliefs and institutions, either adapted to Roman oversight, continued in modified forms that accommodated imperial requirements, or retreated to marginal regions where Roman authority remained weak. The establishment of Roman towns and cities, the construction of villas in the countryside, the development of a monetized economy, and the introduction of Latin literacy created new social structures and cultural forms that competed with and gradually displaced many traditional practices. The adoption of Roman religious cults by British populations occurred through various mechanisms, including the official establishment of temples to Roman gods in major settlements, the syncretism of Celtic and Roman deities, whose attributes could be partially aligned, and the personal religious choices of individuals who found Roman religious practices attractive or useful for social advancement. The inscriptional evidence from Roman Britain reveals numerous examples of religious syncretism, where Celtic deity names were combined with Roman divine appellations, suggesting that at least some elements of pre-Roman religious traditions survived by adapting to Roman religious frameworks. The inscription dedicated to Sulis Minerva at the temple complex in Bath exemplifies this syncretic process, where the Celtic goddess Sulis, associated with the sacred hot springs, was identified with the Roman goddess Minerva, creating a cult that incorporated elements from both traditions while operating within the infrastructure and institutional frameworks of Roman urban religion. The archaeological evidence from the Bath temple complex reveals the sophisticated engineering required to manage the hot spring waters, the construction of Roman-style temple buildings and bathing facilities, and the dedication of offerings, including curse tablets, inscribed with requests that the goddess punish thieves or enemies of the supplicants. The question of whether Druids, as a distinct class of religious specialists, continued operating during the Roman period in Britain remains contested among scholars, with some arguing that Roman suppression effectively eliminated Druidic institutions, while others suggest that some Druidic functions may have continued in transformed or diminished forms, particularly in rural areas where Roman cultural influence remained limited. The explicit references to Druids in sources describing Roman Britain become extremely rare after the 1st century of the Common Era, suggesting that whatever forms of traditional religious specialists may have continued practicing, they no longer functioned as an organized hierarchy with significant political influence. The Roman prohibition on Druidic practices, attested in various imperial edicts recorded by classical historians, aimed specifically at eliminating human sacrifice and other ritual practices Romans considered barbaric, but may have been enforced with varying degrees of rigor depending on local conditions and the priorities of particular governors. The archaeological evidence for the continuing importance of certain sacred sites during the Roman period, including locations like Lydney Park in Gloucestershire, where a major temple complex was constructed in the 4th century of the Common Era, dedicated to a deity called Nodens, suggests that some pre-Roman sacred locations maintained religious significance, even as the specific practices and beliefs associated with them evolved. The discovery of votive offerings, healing shrines, and temple complexes at various locations across Roman Britain indicates that religious life remained vibrant and diverse, incorporating elements from Roman, Celtic, and eventually Christian traditions in complex configurations that varied by region, social class, and time period. The gradual spread of Christianity through Roman Britain, beginning perhaps as early as the 2nd century of the Common Era, but accelerating significantly during the 4th century, following Constantine's legitimization of Christian worship, created new religious competition and eventually a new dominant religious framework that would further marginalize surviving pre-Roman religious practices. The collapse of Roman administrative authority in Britain during the early 5th century of the Common Era, as military forces were withdrawn to defend threatened continental territories, and the imperial government ceased maintaining effective control over the province, created conditions of political fragmentation and cultural transformation, whose details remain frustratingly obscure due to the near-complete absence of contemporary written sources. The traditional narrative describing this period as one of invasions by Germanic peoples from continental Europe, including Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, who displaced or subjugated the Romano-British population, has been significantly complicated by archaeological evidence suggesting that the transformation of British society involved complex processes of migration, cultural change, political reorganization, and identity formation that cannot be reduced to simple conquest narratives. The question of what happened to Druidic traditions or their descendants during this period of upheaval presents severe methodological challenges, as the sources available for reconstructing 5th and 6th century British history consist primarily of later medieval texts, whose historical reliability remains disputed, and archaeological evidence that can document material, cultural changes but cannot directly illuminate religious beliefs and practices. The Romano-British population that inhabited the territories that would later become England presumably maintained some form of Christian religious observance inherited from the late Roman period, though the institutional structures supporting organized Christianity likely degraded significantly as urban centers declined and communications with continental church authorities became irregular. The question of whether pre-Christian religious practices persisted among some elements of the population, particularly in rural areas where Christianization may have remained superficial, cannot be answered definitively from available evidence, but seems probable given the incomplete nature of religious change processes in most historical contexts. The incoming Germanic populations brought their own pre-Christian religious traditions from continental homelands, creating a religious landscape during the 5th through 7th centuries that likely included Christian communities among some Romano-British populations, Germanic polytheistic practices among settler groups, and possibly residual Celtic religious traditions among populations in regions where Germanic cultural influence remained limited. The literary sources, composed in later centuries that purport to describe this period, including the works of Gildas writing in the 6th century and Bede writing in the early 8th century, provide perspectives shaped by Christian theological frameworks and political concerns of their own times, rather than contemporary accounts of religious diversity and change. Gildas's passionate denunciations of British political leaders and his interpretation of Saxon invasions as divine punishment for British sins reflects his Christian worldview, but provides little specific information about non-Christian religious practices that may have persisted. The life of St. Patrick, in versions compiled during the 7th and later centuries from earlier materials and oral traditions, provides glimpses of Celtic Christianity developing in Ireland during the 5th century, including references to encounters with Druids who opposed Patrick's missionary activities and competed with Christian evangelists for the allegiance of Irish kings and populations. These Irish sources describing conflicts between Christian missionaries and Druids in 5th century Ireland raise questions about whether similar situations might have occurred in Britain, though the absence of comparable British sources from this period makes any conclusions speculative. The archaeological evidence for religious practices during the 5th through 7th centuries remains challenging to interpret, as pagan burials from this period can be difficult to distinguish from Christian burials, unless grave goods or other distinctive features provide clear indicators, while specifically Christian material culture becomes more readily identifiable only from the later 6th century onward as church construction and Christian artistic traditions become established. The conversion of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to Christianity during the late 6th and 7th centuries, beginning with Augustine's mission to Kent in 597 of the Common Era under the sponsorship of Pope Gregory the Great, created new religious frameworks and power structures that would fundamentally shape religious life in what was becoming England. The multiple routes through which Christianity spread through Anglo-Saxon territories, including not only the Roman mission operating from Canterbury, but also Celtic Christian influences, extending from Ireland through Scotland and northern England, created initial tensions between different ecclesiastical traditions that were eventually resolved in favour of Roman practices at the Synod of Whitby in 664. The establishment of episcopal dioceses, the construction of monasteries, serving as centres of learning and manuscript production, and the gradual Christianization of royal courts and aristocratic families created institutional infrastructures through which Christian doctrine and practice could be systematically promoted throughout the population. The process of converting populations from pre-Christian religious practices to Christianity involved not only theological instruction and missionary preaching, but also the practical strategies of church leaders who deliberately built Christian churches on sites previously considered sacred in pre-Christian traditions, adapted existing festivals to Christian calendrical observances, and incorporated or reinterpreted pre-existing ritual practices within Christian frameworks. The famous letter from Pope Gregory the Great to Abbot Mellitus in 601, preserved by Bede, explicitly instructed missionaries not to destroy pagan temples, but to convert them into churches, to substitute Christian festivals for pagan ones, and to allow the sacrificing of animals at Christian celebrations in place of pagan sacrifices to demons, recognizing that complete transformation of religious practices required gradual adaptation rather than immediate abolition of familiar customs. This pragmatic approach to conversion created situations where Christian and pre-Christian elements coexisted and blended in ways that would influence popular religious practices for centuries, contributing to forms of Christianity that incorporated traditional beliefs about sacred springs, healing wells, protective charms, and supernatural beings whose origins lay partly in pre-Christian worldviews. The question of what specifically happened to any surviving Druidic traditions or practitioners during the Anglo-Saxon conversion period remains unanswerable from direct evidence, but the general process of religious change suggests that whatever remnants of organized pre-Roman religious institutions may have survived the Roman period would have faced even greater pressure during the systematic Christianization of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The explicit prohibitions against pagan practices found in Anglo-Saxon law codes, including penalties for worshipping idols, conducting sacrifices to demons, or practicing various forms of magic and divination, indicate that church authorities recognized the persistence of non-Christian religious activities and sought to eliminate them through legal sanctions backed by royal authority. The specific practices condemned in these legal codes typically involved activities that church authorities categorized as superstitious or demonic rather than organized religious institutions, suggesting that by the Anglo-Saxon period, pre-Christian religious traditions survived primarily as folk practices rather than as formal systems, with dedicated specialists, comparable to the Druids described in classical sources. The archaeological evidence from Anglo-Saxon cemeteries reveals the gradual transition from burials with grave goods, characteristic of pre-Christian practices, to Christian burial customs involving east-west oriented graves, without grave goods, a process that occurred at different rates in different regions and social classes throughout the 7th and 8th centuries. The construction of Christian churches and monasteries during this period frequently occurred at locations that had held previous religious significance, sometimes incorporating architectural elements or stones from earlier structures, and occasionally revealing through excavation evidence of pre-Christian ritual activity at the same sites. The medieval period in England, spanning roughly from the Norman conquest of 1066 through the late 15th century, witnessed the complete dominance of Christianity in institutional religious life. While folk traditions preserving elements potentially derived from pre-Christian practices continued in various forms despite periodic ecclesiastical campaigns against superstitious beliefs and magical practices, the question of Druids during this period becomes primarily a question of how literate medieval authors understood and represented information about pre-Roman religious practices that they encountered in classical texts or in oral traditions transmitted through generations. The survival and copying of classical manuscripts, including works by Caesar, Tacitus, Pliny, and other Roman authors who had written about Druids, ensured that educated medieval readers had access to descriptions of ancient Celtic religious practices, though they interpreted these accounts through medieval Christian theological frameworks that categorized pagan religions as demonic deceptions rather than legitimate alternative understandings of divine reality. The medieval chronicles and historical compilations produced by monastic scriptoria occasionally reference Druids when discussing the ancient history of Britain, typically relying on classical sources and treating Druids as historical figures from the distant past, rather than as elements of contemporary religious life. Geoffrey of Monmouth's immensely influential History of the Kings of Britain, composed around 1136, and presenting a legendary account of British history from its supposed founding by Brutus of Troy through the Anglo-Saxon period, included references to prophets and wise men in ancient British courts, who performed some functions reminiscent of Druidic roles described in classical sources, though Geoffrey did not explicitly identify these figures as Druids. The character of Merlin, who became one of the most famous figures in medieval literature through Geoffrey's writings and subsequent Arthurian romances, possessed characteristics including prophetic abilities, knowledge of natural magic, and advisory roles to kings that bore some resemblance to classical descriptions of Druidic functions, though the connections remained implicit rather than explicit. The development of Arthurian literature during the 12th and 13th centuries created enduring cultural narratives about the British past that incorporated elements potentially derived from genuine Celtic traditions alongside medieval literary conventions, theological themes, and chivalric ideals, producing a complex legendary tradition whose relationship to historical reality remained ambiguous. The question of whether genuine oral traditions preserving information about Druids or other pre-Christian religious practices survived into the medieval period in forms that influenced literary productions remains debated among scholars, with some arguing that medieval Welsh literature preserves authentic materials from earlier periods, while others emphasize the extensive medieval Christian transformation of whatever earlier traditions may have existed. The Welsh medieval manuscripts, including the Mabinogion collection, contain stories featuring magical practitioners, transformations, otherworldly journeys, and supernatural beings that some scholars interpret as preserving elements of pre-Christian Celtic mythology, though these tales reached their surviving written forms only after centuries of oral transmission and Christian editing that make confident identification of genuine pre-Christian elements extremely difficult. The medieval church's attitudes toward magical practices and folk beliefs involved complex negotiations between outright condemnation of activities considered heretical or demonic and pragmatic accommodation of popular practices that could be reinterpreted within Christian frameworks or tolerated as harmless customs. The distinction drawn by medieval theologians between natural magic, involving knowledge of occult properties of natural substances, and demonic magic, involving pacts with evil spirits, created space for learned individuals to pursue astrological, alchemical, and medical knowledge that involved manipulating hidden natural forces without necessarily incurring accusations of heresy. The wise women and cunning folk who provided magical services including healing, divination, love charms, and curse removal in medieval and early modern communities performed social functions that bore some resemblance to descriptions of Druids as keepers of traditional knowledge and practitioners of ritual activities. Though any direct continuity between Iron Age Druids and medieval magical practitioners remains impossible to demonstrate, the geographical regions where Celtic languages continued to be spoken, including Wales, Cornwall, and parts of Scotland, presumably maintained cultural traditions with longer continuities to pre-Christian practices than regions that had undergone more complete linguistic and cultural transformation, though the extent to which these traditions preserved specifically Druidic elements rather than more general Celtic cultural features cannot be determined from available evidence. The Renaissance and Reformation periods of the 16th century brought significant changes to English, religious, and intellectual life that would eventually influence how Druids were understood and represented. The Protestant Reformation, initiated by Henry VIII's break with Rome in 1533 and continued through the reigns of his successors, transformed English Christianity by eliminating monasteries, changing liturgical practices, and establishing the monarch as the supreme head of the English Church. The dissolution of the monasteries beginning in 1536 resulted in the dispersal of monastic libraries that had preserved medieval manuscripts, including copies of classical texts, though many of these works were subsequently acquired by antiquarian collectors and eventually found their way into institutional collections where scholars could access them. The development of printing technology during the late 15th and 16th centuries made classical texts, including works describing Druids, available to broader audiences than had previously been possible when manuscripts had to be copied laboriously by hand. The publication of edited classical texts by humanist scholars who applied new philological methods to establishing accurate versions of ancient authors created improved access to Roman accounts of Celtic, Britain, and Gaul. The antiquarian movement that developed during the 16th century reflected growing interest among educated English elites in documenting and understanding the history and material remains of their own country, leading to systematic efforts to record ancient monuments, collect historical documents, and develop chronologies for British history before the Norman conquest. John Leland, appointed King's Antiquary by Henry VIII, travelled throughout England during the 1530s and 1540s, recording information about antiquities, libraries, and historical sites, producing voluminous notes that would influence subsequent antiquarian research despite remaining unpublished during his lifetime. William Camden's Britannia, first published in 1586 and subsequently revised and expanded in multiple editions, represented the first comprehensive topographical and historical survey of Britain, incorporating information from classical sources, medieval chronicles, and Camden's own travels throughout the country examining ancient remains. Camden's discussion of ancient British history drew on classical authors, including Caesar and Tacitus, presenting information about Druids in the context of describing pre-Roman British society. The growing interest in Stonehenge and other prehistoric monuments during this period led to speculation about their origins and purposes, with some antiquarians beginning to attribute these structures to Druids based on classical descriptions of Druidic religious activities and the apparent sacred functions of the monuments. The antiquarian Inigo Jones, better known as an architect, produced a study of Stonehenge, arguing that it had been a Roman temple, though his interpretation would later be challenged by other antiquarians who developed alternative theories about the monument's origins. The development of more systematic approaches to studying material remains and historical evidence during the 16th and early 17th centuries created foundations for later antiquarian research that would increasingly focus on Druids as significant figures in ancient British history. The 17th century witnessed significant developments in English antiquarian scholarship that would profoundly influence how Druids were understood and incorporated into narratives about national history and identity. The political upheavals of the Civil War period, the Commonwealth, and the Restoration created intense interest in questions of legitimate authority, ancient constitutions, and the historical foundations of English liberties. leading scholars to investigate earlier periods of British history for precedents and arguments supporting various political positions. John Aubrey, the most innovative antiquarian of his generation, conducted extensive fieldwork examining prehistoric monuments throughout England and Wales, producing detailed descriptions and illustrations that documented these sites with unprecedented accuracy. Aubrey's manuscript, Monumenta Britannica, though never published during his lifetime, presented the revolutionary argument that monuments like Stonehenge and Avebury had been constructed not by Romans or other classical peoples, but by the ancient Britons themselves, specifically by Druids who had served as the priests and learned men of pre-Roman British society. His reasoning combined observations about the monument's architectural features, which differed from Roman building styles, with information from classical sources describing Druidic religious activities and British resistance to Roman conquest. Aubrey's identification of Druids as the builders of megalithic monuments rested partly on the fact that classical sources describe Druids as the indigenous British intellectual class, and partly on the absence of alternative explanations for these structures that seemed more plausible given available evidence. The methodological innovation of Aubrey's approach lay in his systematic fieldwork, documenting monuments through careful observation and measurement, rather than relying solely on textual sources. Though his interpretations of the evidence remained speculative and often incorrect, according to modern archaeological understanding, William Stukeley, perhaps the most influential 18th century antiquarian, focusing on Druids, combined meticulous fieldwork, recording prehistoric monuments, with increasingly elaborate theories that connected these structures to Druidic religion and ultimately to primitive Christianity. Stukeley's career demonstrates the complex relationship between serious antiquarian research and religious enthusiasm that characterized much 18th century scholarship on Druids. His early publications including Stonehenge, a temple restored to the British Druids, published in 1740, and Avebury, a temple of the British Druids, published in 1743, presented detailed surveys of these monuments, alongside arguments that they had functioned as Druidic temples, incorporating sophisticated astronomical alignments and religious symbolism. Stukeley's fieldwork at Stonehenge and Avebury produced accurate plans and illustrations that remain valuable historical records of these sites' conditions during the 18th century, documenting features that have since been damaged or destroyed. His interpretation of the monuments, however, increasingly departed from evidence-based reasoning as he developed elaborate theories about Druidic religion, representing a pure form of patriarchal monotheism derived from Abraham and serving as preparation for Christianity. The progression of Stukeley's thinking about Druids illustrates the influence of religious concerns on antiquarian interpretations, as he became convinced that Druids had worshipped a trinity and possessed knowledge of Christian theological truths, making ancient Britain a kind of proto-Christian society whose religion required only minor corrections to become fully Christian. These religious interpretations reflected Stukeley's Anglican convictions and his desire to counter diced arguments by demonstrating that natural religion, throughout history, had consistently revealed fundamental Christian truths. The visual impact of Stukeley's published illustrations depicting Stonehenge and Avebury as Druidic temples contributed significantly to fixing these associations in popular consciousness, as his images circulated widely and influenced how subsequent generations imagined ancient British religious practices. The 18th century antiquarian literature on Druids reflected broader Enlightenment interests in comparative religion, the origins of civilization, and the development of human societies from primitive to advanced conditions. Scholars attempted to synthesize information from classical sources, archaeological evidence, and comparative ethnographic observations of contemporary non-European peoples to construct comprehensive accounts of ancient British society and religion. The Romantic movement of the late 18th and early 19th centuries transformed cultural attitudes toward Druids and ancient Britain in ways that emphasized emotional engagement, imaginative reconstruction, and national identity, rather than antiquarian precision and historical accuracy. The development of romantic aesthetics that valorized wild nature, sublime landscapes, and connections to the distant past created new cultural frameworks, within which ancient monuments and the Druids associated with them could be appreciated and reimagined. The painter John Constable and other landscape artists of the period depicted ancient monuments in atmospheric settings that emphasized their mysterious and evocative qualities rather than documenting them as objects of antiquarian study. William Blake's visionary poetry and art incorporated Druids into complex mythological systems that combined biblical imagery, Celtic references, and Blake's own prophetic imagination to create alternatives to rational Enlightenment thinking. Blake's poem, Jerusalem, includes references to Druidic temples and presents Druids as representatives of natural religion that had to be superseded by Christian revelation, though his treatment characteristically transformed historical materials into vehicles for expressing his theological and political visions. The Welsh cultural revival movement of the 18th and 19th centuries created contexts for renewed interest in Celtic traditions, including supposed connections to ancient Druids. Edward Williams, better known by his bardic name, Iolo Morganwg, emerged as the most influential, though also most controversial figure in the Welsh cultural revival, through his claims to possess authentic ancient manuscripts, preserving Druidic traditions, and his establishment of the Gorsedd of Bards ceremony in 1792. Iolo Morganwg's activities combined genuine enthusiasm for Welsh culture and language with systematic forgery of medieval manuscripts that he claimed documented continuous bardic traditions, extending back to the Druids of antiquity. His fabrications included poetry attributed to medieval Welsh bards, historical documents describing bardic and Druidic practices, and accounts of an organization called the Gorsedd that he claimed had preserved Druidic teaching through the centuries. The triadic system Iolo promoted, presenting Welsh bardic and Druidic wisdom in groups of 3 statements, drew on genuine medieval Welsh literary forms, but extended them into elaborate systems of his own invention. Despite the fraudulent nature of much of Iolo's work, which scholars gradually exposed during the 19th and 20th centuries, his Gorsedd ceremony became permanently incorporated into the Welsh national Eisteddfod, where it continues to be performed at the beginning of each annual festival. The ceremony involves participants wearing robes of different colours, indicating their rank within the bardic hierarchy, processing to a stone circle specially erected for the occasion, and conducting proceedings in Welsh using elaborate ceremonial language that Iolo had invented or adapted from various sources. The popularity of Iolo Morganwg's creations reflected widespread desire among Welsh cultural nationalists to assert the antiquity and dignity of Welsh traditions against English, cultural and political dominance, making questions about historical authenticity seem less important than the symbolic and emotional functions these ceremonies performed. The broader European Romantic movement's interest in folk cultures, national characters rooted in distant history, and organic connections between peoples and their ancestral lands created cultural contexts where claims about continuous Druidic traditions could gain credence despite lacking solid historical foundations. The development of Romantic nationalism throughout Europe during the 19th century frequently involved construction of narratives about ancient national origins that served contemporary political objectives by establishing historical claims to territorial integrity, cultural superiority, or political independence. The presentation of Druids as ancient British worthies whose wisdom and learning equaled or exceeded that of classical civilizations appealed to English and Welsh nationalists, seeking to establish cultural parity with societies claiming descent from Greek or Roman antiquity. The Victorian period witnessed dramatic expansion of archaeological excavations at prehistoric sites throughout Britain, producing new material evidence that both illuminated ancient British society and raised challenging questions about the relationship between archaeological findings and textual traditions regarding Druids. The development of more systematic excavation techniques, the establishment of learned societies dedicated to archaeological research, and growing public interest in discoveries from the ancient world created conditions for unprecedented expansion of archaeological knowledge. The excavations conducted at sites like Avebury, Stonehenge, and various barrows and hill forts throughout England produced artifacts, human remains, and structural information that enabled more sophisticated understanding of prehistoric British chronology and material culture. The discovery of increasingly ancient sites and artifacts raised questions about the timeframe during which Druids could plausibly have been active, as archaeological evidence demonstrated that monuments like Stonehenge had been constructed thousands of years before the Iron Age period, when classical sources described Druidic activities. The tension between antiquarian traditions attributing megalithic monuments to Druids and archaeological evidence suggesting much earlier construction dates created controversies that gradually led to abandonment of Druidic attribution for bronze Neolithic monuments among professional archaeologists, though popular culture often maintained these associations. The development of prehistoric archaeology as a distinct discipline during the 19th century involved creating chronological frameworks that could organize material remains into meaningful sequences representing the development of human societies through successive stages. The three-age system, dividing prehistory into stone, bronze, and iron ages, provided a basic framework that archaeologists refined through careful attention to artifact typologies, stratigraphy, and comparative analysis of materials from different sites. The recognition that different artifact styles and construction techniques characterize different periods enabled archaeologists to date sites and monuments more accurately than had been possible when antiquarians relied primarily on speculation and classical references. The application of these chronological frameworks to British prehistoric monuments demonstrated that the megalithic structures antiquarians had attributed to Druids actually predated by millennia the Iron Age period, when Druids could antiquarians plausibly have been active. The gradual acceptance among scholars that Stonehenge and similar monuments were Neolithic constructions rather than Druidic temples represented a significant correction to earlier antiquarian theories, though the process of revising these long-established associations proceeded slowly as new archaeological evidence accumulated. The archaeological investigation of Iron Age sites, including hill forts, settlements, and burial grounds, provided genuine evidence for the societies that had produced the Druids described in classical sources, enabling more accurate understanding of late prehistoric British material culture, even as it demolished cherished theories about Druidic connections to earlier monuments. The excavations at sites like Maiden Castle in Dorset revealed the impressive scale and sophistication of Iron Age fortifications, while producing artifacts that documented trade connections, craft production, and burial practices of the period. The discovery of richly furnished Iron Age burials, including chariot burials in Yorkshire and warrior burials with weapons and other grave goods throughout Britain, demonstrated social hierarchies and belief systems that provided context for understanding how religious specialists, like Druids, would have functioned within these societies. The development of Celtic art studies during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, analyzing the distinctive decorative styles found on metalwork, pottery, and stone carvings from Iron Age contexts, revealed sophisticated artistic traditions and possible symbolic systems that may have related to religious beliefs and practices. The Victorian fascination with Druids extended far beyond academic archaeology and antiquarianism to influence popular culture and various forms of cultural performance that incorporated Druidic imagery and themes. The novels of Edward Bulwer-Lytton and other popular authors included Druids as characters representing ancient wisdom, magical powers, and connections to the mysterious British past. The operatic and theatrical performances that featured Druidic themes, including Bellini's opera Norma, with its dramatic portrayal of a Druid priestess in Roman Gaul, brought Druidic imagery to wide audiences and shaped popular conceptions of how ancient Celtic religious practices might have appeared. The transition from Victorian Romanticism about Druids to 20th century scholarly and popular approaches reflected both the professionalization of archaeology and the development of new forms of cultural engagement with the past. The establishment of university departments of archaeology, the creation of professional archaeological societies, and the development of standardized excavation and recording methods transformed how prehistoric Britain was studied and understood. The recognition that Druids belonged specifically to the Iron Age period, and that many monuments previously attributed to them dated to much earlier periods, created clearer chronological frameworks, while also diminishing the role of Druids in explanations of British prehistory. The archaeological investigations of Iron Age Britain during the early 20th century focused increasingly on understanding settlement patterns, agricultural systems, trade networks, and material culture, rather than attempting to identify sites associated with religious practices or specific historical groups like Druids. The practical difficulties of identifying religious functions or activities from archaeological remains alone, given that ritual practices often leave minimal material traces, and that artifacts can rarely be conclusively identified as having religious, rather than secular purposes, meant that Druids largely disappeared from professional archaeological discourse, except when directly relevant to interpreting specific finds. The discovery of unusual deposits or burial practices at some Iron Age sites, including apparent evidence for ritual killing of animals or humans, and the deposition of valuable objects in ways suggesting offerings rather than accidental loss, provided occasional contexts where Druids might be invoked as possible actors, though archaeologists generally remained cautious about attributing specific finds to Druidic activities without explicit supporting evidence. The bog body discoveries at sites like Lindo Moss, which provided extraordinary preservation of human remains and enabled detailed forensic analysis, created renewed archaeological interest in Iron Age ritual practices and potential connections to Druidic activities described in classical sources. The Lindo Man discovery in particular, with evidence suggesting ritual killing and deposition in a bog that may have been considered sacred, prompted extensive discussion about whether this represented Druidic human sacrifice of the type described by Caesar and other Roman authors. The forensic evidence indicating multiple methods of killing, the presence of mistletoe pollen in the digestive tract, and various other details that corresponded to classical descriptions suggested possible connections to Druidic rituals, though scholars recognized that definitive proof remained impossible and that alternative explanations for the evidence existed. The development of radiocarbon dating techniques during the mid-20th century revolutionized prehistoric archaeology by providing absolute chronological frameworks that could be applied to organic materials, including human remains, enabling much more precise dating of sites and artifacts than had been possible through typological comparisons alone. The application of radiocarbon dating to British prehistoric sites confirmed the great antiquity of Neolithic monuments, while also establishing more precise chronologies for Iron Age developments, creating firmer foundations for understanding when Druids could plausibly have been active. The emergence of processual archaeology during the 1960s, emphasizing scientific methods, hypothesis testing, and explanation of cultural change through ecological and economic factors, further distanced professional archaeology from earlier traditions that had focused on identifying specific historical peoples or explaining monuments through reference to classical texts. The post-processual archaeology that developed during the 1980s and 1990s, while critical of earlier processual approaches' neglect of symbolic and religious dimensions of past societies, approached these questions through theoretical frameworks derived from anthropology and social theory, rather than through attempts to correlate archaeological evidence with classical descriptions of Druids. The 20th century witnessed the development of various forms of modern Druidry, or Neo-Druidism, religious and spiritual movements that claimed inspiration from ancient Druids, while creating essentially new traditions adapted to modern concerns and sensibilities. The ancient order of Druids, established in 1781 by Henry Hurle, and subsequently developing into various branches, represented one of the earliest modern organizations using Druidic nomenclature and imagery, though its functions related primarily to fraternal association and mutual benefit provisions, rather than religious practice or claims to represent authentic ancient traditions. The various Druidic organizations that proliferated during the 19th and 20th centuries reflected diverse motivations and purposes, including fraternalism, cultural preservation, nature, spirituality, and reconstructed paganism, creating a complex landscape of modern Druidry that defied simple categorization. The religious forms of modern Druidry that emerged during the 20th century typically presented themselves as nature-based spiritual traditions, emphasizing harmony with natural cycles, reverence for ancient sacred sites, and ethical principles supposedly derived from ancient Druidic teachings. The Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, founded by Ross Nichols in 1964 after splitting from an earlier Druidic organization, became one of the most influential modern Druidic groups, developing elaborate training programs, seasonal ceremonies, and philosophical teachings that combine materials from classical sources, Celtic mythology, modern nature, spirituality, and Nichols' own creative elaborations. The development of modern pagan movements during the 20th century, including Wicca and various forms of reconstructed paganism, created cultural contexts where Druidic spirituality could flourish as one option within a broader spectrum of alternative religious practices. The relationship between modern Druidry and ancient Druids remained complex and contested, with practitioners taking various positions on questions of continuity, authenticity, and the purposes of their practices. Some modern Druids presented their activities as reconstructions of ancient practices based on careful study of historical sources and archaeological evidence, while others frankly acknowledged creating new traditions inspired by but not claiming descent from ancient Druids, and still others maintained beliefs in unbroken transmission of Druidic teachings through hidden or esoteric channels. The academic study of modern Druidry as a contemporary religious movement developed during the late 20th and early 21st centuries, with scholars analyzing these groups using methods from religious studies and anthropology rather than attempting to adjudicate their historical claims. The seasonal ceremonies that became central to modern Druidic practice, particularly celebrations at solstices and equinoxes at ancient sites like Stonehenge, created visible public performances of Druidic identity that attracted media attention and contributed to popular awareness of modern Druidry. The summer solstice celebrations at Stonehenge, which during the late 20th century evolved from small gatherings into major events attracting thousands of participants, exemplified how modern Druids had successfully associated themselves with ancient monuments, despite the lack of historical connection. The negotiations between Druidic groups, site management authorities, and other stakeholders about access to ancient monuments for ceremonial purposes raised practical questions about balancing competing interests, including conservation requirements, public access, religious freedom, and tourism management. The eventual agreements granting managed access to Stonehenge for solstice celebrations represented compromises that acknowledged the cultural significance of these events while addressing concerns about site protection and public safety. The academic study of ancient Druids during the late 20th and early 21st centuries reflected increasingly sophisticated approaches to fragmentary historical evidence and growing awareness of how modern preconceptions and cultural contexts influence interpretation of the past. The recognition that nearly all available information about Druids came from hostile Roman sources written from outsider perspectives created awareness of the severe limitations affecting any reconstruction of Druidic beliefs, practices. The application of post-colonial theoretical frameworks to analysis of Roman accounts highlighted how imperial power relationships shaped the production of knowledge about conquered peoples, suggesting that descriptions of Druids served Roman political and cultural agendas rather than providing objective, ethnographic information. The comparison of Roman accounts of Druids with Roman descriptions of other foreign religious practices revealed common rhetorical patterns, including emphasis on human sacrifice, barbaric customs, and exotic rituals that served to justify Roman conquest and cultural superiority, regardless of the accuracy of specific claims. The archaeological investigation of Iron Age Britain continued producing new evidence about late prehistoric societies, while remaining unable to definitively identify sites or practices as specifically Druidic, rather than more generally Celtic or Iron Age British. The discovery at South Cadbury in Somerset of what excavators interpreted as a possible ritual site, with evidence for feasting and structured deposition of materials, provided intriguing hints about Iron Age religious practices, without enabling definitive connections to Druids described in classical sources. The systematic excavation of Iron Age hill forts, settlements, and religious sites throughout Britain during the late 20th and early 21st centuries produced comprehensive pictures of late prehistoric material culture, settlement patterns, and social organization that provided essential context for understanding the societies within which Druids would have operated. The recognition that Iron Age British societies were not uniform, but included diverse regional traditions, varying degrees of contact with continental European cultures, and different trajectories of social and political development complicated earlier generalizations about Celtic culture and required more nuanced approaches to questions about religious practices and institutions. The linguistic analysis of Celtic languages and place names provided evidence for the geographical extent of Celtic-speaking populations in prehistoric Britain, while revealing little specific information about religious beliefs, practices. The study of Irish medieval literature in Celtic languages, particularly early medieval Irish texts that preserved myths, legends, and some apparently pre-Christian materials, offered possible comparative evidence for understanding British Druidic traditions, though the extent to which Irish sources reflected ancient realities rather than medieval literary creations remained disputed. The archaeological investigation of ritual sites in Ireland, including passage tombs, stone circles, and ceremonial enclosures that had remained important in medieval Irish tradition, provided possible parallels for understanding British sites, though the relationship between archaeological evidence and literary traditions remained complex and often ambiguous. The application of theoretical frameworks from religious studies and anthropology to analysis of Iron Age religion encouraged scholars to consider how religious specialists, like Druids, would have functioned within their social contexts, rather than focusing narrowly on doctrinal beliefs or ritual details mentioned in classical sources. The recognition that religious specialists in many societies perform multiple functions, including medical treatment, legal adjudication, education, and political counsel, alongside specifically ritual activities, helped contextualize classical descriptions of Druids' diverse responsibilities. The contemporary understanding of Druids in early 21st century scholarship reflects acknowledgement of how little can be known with confidence about these ancient religious specialists, while recognizing their significance within late Iron Age Celtic societies. The consensus among professional archaeologists and ancient historians emphasizes that Druids represented a distinct social class within Celtic tribal societies of Britain and Gaul during the final centuries before and the early decades after Roman conquest, performing religious, legal, educational, and political functions that gave them considerable authority and influence. The classical descriptions of Druids, while requiring critical analysis due to their hostile perspectives and political contexts, provide the primary textual evidence for understanding Druidic functions and remain valuable despite their limitations when used carefully alongside archaeological and comparative evidence. The archaeological evidence for late Iron Age Britain documents sophisticated societies with advanced metalworking, extensive trade networks, complex social hierarchies, and cultural traditions that included reverence for certain natural features and constructed monuments, creating contexts within which Druids would have operated as religious and intellectual specialists. The specific archaeological identification of Druidic activities remains extremely difficult, given that ritual practices often leave minimal material traces, and that the functions Druids performed included many activities like education and legal judgment that would not produce distinctive archaeological evidence. The discovery of unusual deposits, ritual killings, and other evidence for religious practices at some Iron Age sites provides general evidence for the ritual dimension of these societies, without enabling confident attribution of specific finds to Druidic rather than other ritual, specialists or community religious activities. The legacy of Druids in English culture extends far beyond scholarly understanding of ancient religious specialists to encompass their role in antiquarian speculation, romantic imagination, national identity formation, and modern spiritual movements. The antiquarian attribution of prehistoric monuments, including Stonehenge, to Druids, while historically incorrect, according to modern archaeological understanding, created lasting cultural associations that continue influencing popular perceptions of both ancient monuments and Druids themselves. The romantic transformation of Druids into symbols of ancient wisdom, natural religion, and Celtic cultural identity reflected 19th century concerns about industrialization, rationalism, and cultural authenticity rather than careful historical analysis. But these reimaginings profoundly influenced how Druids were understood in popular culture. The modern Druidic movements that developed during the 19th and 20th centuries created new religious traditions that claimed inspiration from ancient Druids, while adapting their practices and beliefs to contemporary contexts, spiritual concerns, and ethical frameworks. The relationship between ancient Druids and modern Druidry remains complex, with scholarly understanding emphasizing discontinuity and innovation in modern traditions, while many practitioners maintain beliefs in deeper connections to ancient wisdom traditions. The public ceremonies conducted by modern Druids at ancient sites, particularly seasonal celebrations at Stonehenge, have become recognized cultural events that attract significant participation and media coverage, while raising questions about site management, religious freedom, and the appropriate uses of ancient monuments. The negotiation of access to sites like Stonehenge for Druidic ceremonies reflects broader questions about how contemporary societies should relate to ancient monuments, including balancing conservation requirements against desires for Code 4, experiential engagement, and recognizing diverse cultural meanings these sites hold for different communities. The historiography of Druidic studies reveals how scholarly and popular understandings of ancient Druids have been shaped by the cultural contexts and concerns of successive periods, from Roman conquest through contemporary times. The Roman accounts that provide the foundational textual evidence for Druids reflect imperial perspectives that emphasized exotic and barbaric elements of Celtic religion, while serving political purposes related to justifying conquest, asserting Roman cultural superiority. The medieval preservation and copying of classical texts maintained awareness of Druids among educated elites, while Christian theological frameworks influenced how these ancient pagan religious specialists were understood within salvation, history, and debates about natural religion. The Renaissance and Reformation periods witnessed renewed engagement with classical sources, including accounts of Druids, as antiquarian interests developed alongside nationalist concerns about documenting ancient British history. The 17th and 18th century antiquarians who attributed prehistoric monuments to Druids created influential interpretations that combined fieldwork documentation of ancient sites with speculative theories based on limited evidence and religious preconceptions about primitive monotheism. The Romantic period transformed Druids into symbols of natural religion, ancient wisdom, and Celtic cultural identity that served nationalist and cultural purposes, while departing significantly from evidence-based historical understanding. The Victorian period witnessed both the development of scientific archaeology that gradually corrected earlier speculations about Druids and monuments, and the proliferation of romantic Druidic imagery in popular culture. The 20th century saw the professionalization of archaeology and ancient history that established firmer evidence-based understanding of Iron Age Britain, while also witnessing the development of modern Druidic movements that created new spiritual traditions inspired by ancient Druids. The contemporary scholarly consensus emphasizes the limited nature of available evidence about ancient Druids, while recognizing their significance as religious specialists within late Iron Age Celtic societies, and acknowledging the complex legacy of Druidic imagery and symbolism in English culture. The archaeological investigation of Iron Age Britain continues producing new evidence that refines understanding of late prehistoric societies, while remaining unable to definitively identify specifically Druidic sites or practices from material remains alone. The theoretical sophistication of contemporary approaches to studying ancient religion enables more nuanced understanding of how religious specialists like Druids would have functioned within their social contexts, while acknowledging the severe limitations on recovering specific beliefs and ritual practices from fragmentary evidence. The recognition that modern cultural contexts and concerns inevitably influence how ancient evidence is interpreted encourages reflexive awareness among scholars about their own assumptions and the constructed nature of historical narratives about Druids. The continuing fascination with Druids in popular culture, modern spiritual movements, and public engagement with ancient sites demonstrates that these ancient religious specialists retain cultural significance that extends far beyond their historical roles, serving as symbols that different communities invest with diverse meanings, reflecting contemporary concerns and aspirations. The broader significance of Druids in English history and culture relates not only to their actual roles in late Iron Age societies, but also to how successive generations have imagined, represented, and deployed Druidic imagery for various cultural and political purposes. The process by which Druids became associated with prehistoric monuments, despite archaeological evidence demonstrating these structures predated the Iron Age period by millennia, illustrates how cultural narratives can persist despite contradicting scholarly understanding. The investment of ancient monuments like Stonehenge with Druidic associations reflected desires to connect these impressive structures with known historical groups, rather than acknowledging the greater antiquity and cultural distance of their actual builders. The creation of modern Druidic traditions during the 18th through 20th centuries exemplifies how religious and spiritual movements construct identities and practices through selective appropriation of historical materials, combined with creative innovation responding to contemporary needs. The question of authenticity and continuity in modern Druidry raises broader issues about the relationship between contemporary religious movements and the historical traditions they claim as precedents, with scholars generally emphasizing invention and innovation, while many practitioners assert deeper continuities. The role of Druids in constructions of English and Celtic national identities demonstrates how ancient history becomes deployed in projects of cultural differentiation and political mobilization, with Druids serving various communities as symbols of indigenous resistance to imperialism, ancient wisdom traditions, or distinctive cultural heritage. The academic study of how Druids have been understood and represented across different historical periods provides insights into changing scholarly methods, cultural preoccupations, and the complex relationships between evidence-based historical research and popular cultural narratives. The recognition that very little can be known with confidence about the beliefs, practices, and organization of ancient Druids based on available evidence creates space for diverse interpretations and imaginative reconstructions that serve various cultural functions while claiming varying degrees of historical grounding. The ethical questions raised by modern Druidic use of ancient monuments for ceremonies include considerations about who has authority to determine appropriate uses of heritage sites, how to balance conservation requirements against desires for experiential engagement, and whether modern spiritual movements have legitimate claims to ancient sites based on asserted but historically undemonstrated continuities with ancient traditions. The archaeological community's general acceptance of modern Druidic ceremonies at sites like Stonehenge, despite scholarly consensus that these monuments have no historical connection to Iron Age Druids, reflects pragmatic recognition that sites hold multiple meanings for different communities, and that heritage management involves negotiating among competing interests rather than simply enforcing historical accuracy. The transformation of the summer solstice at Stonehenge from a small countercultural gathering in the 1970s through confrontations between celebrants and authorities in the 1980s to the managed open access events of recent decades illustrates evolving approaches to heritage management, religious freedom, and public engagement with ancient sites. The media coverage of Druidic ceremonies at Stonehenge and other ancient sites contributes to public awareness of these locations, while often perpetuating historical inaccuracies about Druids and monuments that scholars have long since corrected, demonstrating the gap between scholarly and popular understanding that persists despite efforts at public education. The specific archaeological evidence from the Roman period provides some insights into how Druidic or other indigenous religious traditions may have adapted to or resisted Roman conquest and subsequent cultural transformation. The military conquest of Britain, initiated by Claudius in 43 of the Common Era, and continuing through decades of campaigning against resistant tribal groups, created violent disruptions to existing social structures, including religious institutions and practices. The Roman assault on Anglesey, described by Tacitus, specifically targeted what Roman commanders identified as a center of Druidic activity, suggesting Roman military strategists recognized Druids as sources of ideological resistance that needed elimination to secure effective control over British populations. The archaeological evidence from Anglesey includes various ritual sites and deposits suggesting the island's importance as a sacred landscape during the pre-Roman period, though definitively identifying these as specifically Druidic rather than more generally Celtic religious sites remains impossible. The continuing importance of certain sacred sites during the Roman period, as evidenced by temple construction and votive deposits at locations including Bath, Lydney, and various other sites throughout Roman Britain, suggests that at least some pre-Roman religious traditions survived in modified forms that accommodated Roman cultural frameworks. The phenomenon of religious syncretism, whereby Celtic and Roman deities were identified and worshipped together under combined names, indicates that religious change during the Roman period involved complex processes of adaptation rather than simple replacement of indigenous traditions by Roman religious practices. The question of whether Druids as a distinct class of religious specialists continued functioning during the Roman period in Britain cannot be definitively answered from available evidence, though the absence of explicit references to Druids in sources describing Roman Britain after the 1st century suggests that whatever indigenous religious specialists may have continued practicing, they no longer operated as organized institutions with significant political influence. The transformation of religious landscapes during the Roman period included both the construction of Roman-style temples in urban centers and military sites, and the continuing importance of rural shrines and sacred natural features that may have preserved pre-Roman religious significance. The archaeological evidence for rural religious practices during the Roman period often reveals continuity in the locations considered sacred, even as the specific practices and built structures associated with these sites changed to incorporate Roman architectural forms and material culture. The discovery of votive deposits, including coins, jewelry, weapons, and other valuable objects, at springs, rivers, and other water sources throughout Roman Britain, suggests that practices involving offerings to supernatural powers associated with natural features continued throughout the Roman period, regardless of whether specifically Druidic traditions survived. The late Roman period witnessed the gradual spread of Christianity through British provinces, creating new religious alternatives that would eventually become dominant, while initially coexisting with both Roman polytheistic traditions and whatever indigenous religious practices had survived earlier periods of change. The archaeological evidence for Christianity in Roman Britain includes church buildings at some urban sites, Christian symbols on artifacts, and distinctive burial practices that become increasingly common during the 4th century. Though the extent of Christian conversion among rural populations remains difficult to determine from material evidence alone, the post-Roman period, often characterized as the Dark Ages, due to the scarcity of written sources and the collapse of many aspects of Roman material culture, presents severe challenges for understanding religious practices and the possible survival of any Druidic or pre-Christian Celtic traditions. The withdrawal of Roman military and administrative authority during the early 5th century created conditions of political fragmentation and cultural transformation, whose religious dimensions remain largely obscure due to the absence of contemporary documentation. The populations remaining in the territories that would later become England presumably included Christian communities, inheriting traditions from the late Roman period, though the institutional structures supporting organized Christianity likely degraded significantly as urban centers declined and communications with continental church authorities became irregular. The question of whether pre-Christian religious practices persisted or resurged among some population groups during this period cannot be answered definitively from available evidence, though the incomplete nature of Christianization processes in most historical contexts makes some survival or revival of traditional practices probable. The migration of Germanic peoples from continental Europe into eastern and southern Britain during the 5th and 6th centuries introduced populations whose own religious traditions remained predominantly pre-Christian, creating religious diversity and potential competition between Christian, Germanic, polytheistic, and possibly Celtic religious traditions. The archaeological evidence from Anglo-Saxon cemeteries reveals burial practices that reflect pre-Christian beliefs, including grave goods intended for use in afterlife, the orientation of burials according to non-Christian principles, and in some cases evidence for ritual activities associated with burials. The place names preserving elements derived from Germanic deity names, including numerous examples across England incorporating names of gods like Woden, Thunor, and Tu, provide evidence for the geographical extent of Germanic polytheistic religious traditions during the Anglo-Saxon period. The limited textual sources describing this period, including the British monk Gildas, writing in the 6th century, and the Anglo-Saxon missionary Bede, writing in the early 8th century, provide Christian perspectives that condemn paganism without describing non-Christian practices in detail, sufficient to determine whether any specifically Celtic or Druidic traditions persisted. The life of St. Patrick, in versions preserved from the 7th century and later, describes conflicts between the saint and Druids in 5th century Ireland, suggesting that Druidic traditions remained active in Ireland during this period, even if their status, in post-Roman Britain, remains uncertain. The possibility that some religious specialists preserving elements of Celtic traditions may have continued practicing in Western British regions, where Germanic cultural influence remained limited, cannot be excluded, though the absence of evidence prevents confident conclusions. The gradual Christianization of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms during the 7th century, through both the Roman mission operating from Canterbury and Celtic Christian influences, extending from Ireland through northern Britain, created institutional frameworks that would systematically oppose surviving non-Christian religious practices, whether Germanic or Celtic in origin. The strategies employed by missionaries, including the deliberate construction of churches at previously sacred sites, the adaptation of existing festivals to Christian observances, and the incorporation or reinterpretation of traditional practices within Christian frameworks, created situations where pre-Christian elements might survive in modified forms long after official conversion to Christianity. The evidence for understanding Iron Age religious practices more broadly provides important context for considering what roles Druids might have played within these systems, even when specific identification of Druidic activities remains impossible. The archaeological investigation of Iron Age ritual sites, including shrines, structured deposits, and unusual burials, reveals the importance of religious activities in late prehistoric British societies, while demonstrating the diversity of practices that characterized Iron Age religion. The discovery of distinctive deposits, including metalwork, animal remains, human bones, and other materials, placed in pits, ditches, rivers, and bogs suggests ritual disposal practices that may have involved offerings to supernatural powers or deposits associated with divination and other religious purposes. The analysis of faunal remains from Iron Age sites reveals patterns in the treatment of animal bodies that suggest ritual dimensions to slaughter and consumption, with certain species or body parts receiving special treatment that differed from ordinary food waste disposal. The investigation of Iron Age burials reveals diverse practices, including inhumation and cremation, varying amounts of grave goods reflecting social status and belief systems, and occasional unusual burials that may represent ritual killings or special circumstances surrounding particular deaths. The chariot burials discovered in Yorkshire and elsewhere in Britain demonstrate the wealth and social status of certain individuals, while raising questions about the beliefs concerning afterlife that would have motivated the inclusion of vehicles and valuable objects in graves. The regional variations in burial practices, observable across Iron Age Britain, suggest that religious beliefs and ritual traditions differed between tribal groups rather than following uniform patterns throughout all Celtic-speaking populations. The evidence for feasting and communal consumption at certain Iron Age sites suggests religious activities that involved community participation, rather than being exclusively the domain of religious specialists like Druids. The construction and maintenance of hill forts, which required enormous communal labor and served various functions, including defense, political centers, and apparently ritual purposes at some sites, demonstrates the organizational capabilities of Iron Age societies and the resources available for large-scale projects. The discovery of articulated animal skeletons and other deposits in pits at hill fort sites raises questions about ritual practices associated with the construction, use, or abandonment of these monuments. The finds of metalwork, including weapons, tools, and ornaments, deposited in rivers and wet places throughout Britain, suggest religious practices involving offerings to supernatural powers associated with water, a pattern that continued into the Roman period and may reflect long-standing traditions. The interpretation of rock art, including cup and ring marks and other carved designs found on natural rock surfaces and on some monuments, presents challenges, as these markings could reflect various purposes, including religious symbolism, territorial markers, or artistic expression. The continuing use and modification of Neolithic monuments, including stone circles and burial mounds during the Iron Age, evidenced by Iron Age pottery and other materials found at these sites, suggests that these ancient structures retained sacred significance for late prehistoric populations, despite their construction in the distant past. The intellectual traditions of Celtic societies, as described in classical sources and attested indirectly through surviving materials, suggest sophisticated bodies of knowledge that Druids and other learned specialists would have maintained and transmitted. The astronomical knowledge required for constructing monuments with solar and lunar alignments, though predating the Druids themselves, as modern archaeology has demonstrated for Neolithic monuments, indicates that astronomical observation and the tracking of celestial cycles held importance for prehistoric British populations. The preservation of historical and genealogical traditions through oral transmission, mentioned by classical sources as a Druidic function, would have required highly developed memory techniques and systematic training that classical authors described as taking many years to complete. The legal knowledge and judgment functions attributed to Druids in classical sources suggest sophisticated understanding of customary law, precedents for dispute resolution, and principles for maintaining social order within and between tribal groups. The medical knowledge that would have been necessary for treating injuries and illnesses, while not explicitly attributed to Druids in classical sources, represents another domain of specialized learning that some members of Celtic societies must have possessed and transmitted. The metalworking expertise required for producing the sophisticated Iron Age weapons, tools, and ornamental objects found at archaeological sites suggests the existence of skilled craftspeople who may have possessed knowledge considered sacred or magical, given the transformative processes involved in working metals. The knowledge of plants, including their nutritional, medicinal, and potentially psychoactive properties, would have been essential for Iron Age populations and may have been particularly associated with religious specialists, given the widespread connection between healing and religion in many societies. The classical references to Druids using mistletoe in rituals and believing it possessed special properties illustrate the importance of plant knowledge within the religious traditions, though the specific claims made by Roman authors about Celtic beliefs require critical evaluation given their outsider perspectives. The astronomical and seasonal knowledge necessary for agricultural planning, including optimal times for planting and harvesting, would have been culturally important and may have been maintained by specialists, including religious practitioners who conducted seasonal ceremonies, marking key points in the annual cycle. The knowledge of sacred geography, including the locations of sites considered holy, and the proper protocols for interacting with supernatural powers associated with particular places, would have been essential for religious specialists, might have included closely guarded secrets not shared with the broader population. The poetic and rhetorical traditions attested in classical sources through references to bards as a distinct class, separate from but related to Druids, suggest sophisticated verbal arts, including memorized compositions, improvised performances, and specialized language or styles appropriate for different occasions. The divination practices mentioned in classical sources, including reading omens from natural phenomena, interpreting the flight of birds, and examining the remains of sacrificial victims, suggest systematic approaches to obtaining supernatural knowledge about future events or hidden information. The theological and cosmological knowledge concerning the nature of gods, the structure of the universe, and the fate of human souls after death, which classical sources attribute to Druidic teaching, suggests intellectual engagement with fundamental questions about existence, even though the specific content of these teachings remains unknown beyond the classical claims about beliefs in transmigration of souls. The role of Druids in Iron Age political systems, as described in classical sources, suggests they functioned as important political actors whose authority derived from religious status but extended into secular governance through their judicial functions and their influence over rulers. The ability to exclude individuals from sacrifices and thus make them social outcasts, mentioned by Caesar as a form of punishment that Druids could impose, indicates that religious authority translated into effective social control mechanisms. The advisory relationships between Druids and political leaders, suggested by classical sources and by the Irish medieval literature describing Druids counselling kings, illustrate how religious specialists could influence political decision-making through their claims to supernatural knowledge and their roles as keepers of traditional wisdom. The educational functions attributed to Druids, including the training of young nobles, suggest their involvement in social reproduction and the maintenance of elite cultural identity across generations. The role of Druids in adjudicating disputes between individuals and tribes, mentioned in classical sources as an important function, suggests they served as neutral arbiters whose religious authority made their judgments acceptable to parties who might not accept decisions from political leaders with factional alignments. The annual gatherings of Druids, described by Caesar as occurring at a sacred location in central Gaul, suggest organizational structures extending across tribal boundaries, creating networks of authority that transcended local political units. The question of whether similar organizational structures existed among Druids in Britain remains uncertain, as classical sources provide less detailed information about British Druids than about their Gallic counterparts. The possibility that Druids formed a distinct social class with endogamous marriage patterns, hereditary transmission of status and knowledge within families, and collective economic interests separate from warrior elites and agricultural producers cannot be confirmed from available evidence, but would be consistent with patterns observable in other societies with specialized religious practitioners. The relationship between Druids and other potential authority figures within Iron Age societies, including military leaders, tribal kings, and wealthy aristocrats, would have involved both cooperation and potential tension, as different sources of authority competed or collaborated in governing communities. The Roman perception of Druids as dangerous opponents of imperial authority reflects recognition that these religious specialists wielded sufficient influence to mobilize resistance, and that eliminating or co-opting them was necessary for effective Roman control over conquered populations. The specific measures Roman authorities took to suppress Druidic activities, including military action against Druidic centers like Anglesey and legal prohibitions on Druidic practices, demonstrate imperial awareness of the political dimensions of Celtic religious institutions. The legacy of Druids in English cultural memory extends through multiple channels, including antiquarian scholarship, romantic literature, nationalist movements, modern spiritual traditions, and popular culture, creating a complex web of associations and meanings that far exceed the limited historical evidence about actual Iron Age religious specialists. The process through which Druids became established in English consciousness as significant figures from the national past involved the convergence of various factors, including the availability of classical texts describing them, the existence of impressive prehistoric monuments requiring explanation, and cultural needs for indigenous traditions that could rival the classical heritage claimed by other European nations. The association of Druids with Stonehenge and other megalithic monuments, though archaeologically incorrect, proved culturally powerful and persistent because it provided satisfying narratives, connecting visible ancient structures with known historical groups, while investing these monuments with romantic associations of ancient wisdom and mysterious powers. The use of Druidic imagery in English literature from the medieval period through contemporary times reflects changing cultural concerns and aesthetic movements, while maintaining certain recurring themes, including Druids as wise counselors, as practitioners of natural magic, as representatives of ancient British resistance to foreign conquest, and as symbols of harmony with nature. The adoption of Druidic organizational structures and nomenclature by various voluntary associations during the 18th and 19th centuries including friendly societies, providing mutual aid to members, demonstrates how Druidic imagery could be deployed for entirely non-religious purposes while maintaining associations with ancient wisdom and brotherhood. The Romantic nationalism of the 19th century found in Druids useful symbols for Celtic cultural distinctiveness and historical depth that could counter narratives of English or Anglo-Saxon superiority while providing cultural resources for political movements seeking greater autonomy or independence for Celtic regions. The specific role of Druids in Welsh cultural nationalism, exemplified through the Gorsedd ceremonies, incorporated into the national Eisteddfod, illustrates how invented traditions could successfully establish themselves as authentic expressions of cultural identity, regardless of their actual historical basis. The development of modern pagan and nature spirituality movements during the 20th and 21st centuries created new contexts where Druidic identity could serve religious and spiritual functions for practitioners seeking alternatives to mainstream religious traditions. The environmental movement's adoption of Druidic imagery and associations, connecting Druids with reverence for nature and opposition to destructive exploitation of natural resources, reflects contemporary concerns that have little to do with historical Iron Age realities, but find useful symbolic expression through Druidic associations with sacred groves and natural settings. The contemporary situation regarding Druids in England reflects the coexistence of multiple understandings and uses of Druidic imagery, serving different purposes for different communities. The scholarly consensus among archaeologists and ancient historians emphasizes the limited and problematic nature of available evidence about Iron Age Druids, while recognizing their historical significance as religious specialists, late prehistoric Celtic societies. The continuing archaeological investigation of Iron Age Britain produces refined understanding of late prehistoric societies, while remaining unable to identify specifically Druidic sites or practices with confidence from material evidence alone. The modern Druidic movements that conduct ceremonies at ancient sites and maintain organizations devoted to nature, spirituality, and Celtic traditions create living traditions that claim inspiration from ancient Druids, while frankly acknowledging or implicitly accepting the discontinuity between their practices and whatever historical realities characterized Iron Age religious specialists. The heritage management authorities responsible for ancient monuments, including English heritage at Stonehenge, negotiate complex relationships with modern Druidic groups whose ceremonial use of sites raises questions about appropriate activities at protected monuments, while also reflecting legitimate forms of cultural engagement with the past. The summer solstice gathering at Stonehenge represents the most visible expression of modern Druidic activity, attracting thousands of participants, including self-identified Druids, pagans, tourists, and others drawn by various motivations to experience the sunrise at this ancient monument. The media coverage of these events contributes to public awareness of both the monuments and modern Druidry, while often perpetuating historical misconceptions about connections between Iron Age Druids and Neolithic stone circles. The academic study of modern Druidry as a contemporary religious movement has produced scholarship analyzing these groups using methods from religious studies, anthropology, and sociology, while bracketing questions about the historical accuracy of their claims in favor of understanding their contemporary significance and functions. The recognition that Druids function simultaneously as historical subjects studied by scholars, as symbols deployed for various cultural and political purposes, and as identities claimed by modern spiritual practitioners, creates complex analytical challenges, requiring careful attention to which Druids are being discussed in any given context. The popular culture representations of Druids in films, novels, games, and other media draw on the accumulated layers of Druidic imagery and associations, while contributing new elements that influence how subsequent generations imagine these figures. The commercial exploitation of Druidic imagery through tourism promotion, product marketing, and entertainment industries demonstrates the continuing cultural resonance of Druids, even as it further distances popular representations from historical realities. The educational efforts by museums, heritage sites, and scholars to provide accurate information about Iron Age Britain, and the limited evidence for Druids face challenges competing with more dramatic and romantic narratives that popular culture perpetuates. The question of what can legitimately be claimed about ancient Druids, given the limitations of available evidence, requires careful attention to the differences between reasonable inferences based on material and textual evidence, speculative theories that extend beyond firm evidence, and imaginative reconstructions that acknowledge their creative dimensions. The textual evidence from classical sources, while valuable as the primary written materials describing Druids, requires critical analysis, recognizing that these accounts reflect Roman perspectives and political contexts, rather than neutral ethnographic observation. The archaeological evidence from Iron Age Britain documents sophisticated societies with complex social organization, advanced material culture, and diverse religious practices, but cannot definitively identify specific sites or artifacts as Druidic, rather than more generally Celtic or Iron Age British. The comparative evidence from anthropological studies of religious specialists in other societies provides useful frameworks for understanding how Druids might have functioned within Iron Age social systems, while recognizing that each society develops unique religious institutions adapted to its particular circumstances. The later medieval Celtic literature from Ireland and Wales preserves materials that some scholars interpret as containing genuine pre-Christian traditions, while others emphasize the extensive Christian transformation and medieval literary conventions that shape these texts. The place name evidence preserving Celtic linguistic elements provides information about the geographical extent of Celtic languages in Britain, but offers limited insight into religious practices or beliefs. The synthesis of these various forms of evidence enables reasonable conclusions that Druids were religious specialists within late Iron Age Celtic societies of Britain and Gaul, who performed ritual, legal, educational, and advisory functions that gave them significant social authority, that they maintained and transmitted bodies of traditional knowledge through oral rather than written means, that they were opposed by Roman authorities who viewed them as sources of resistance to imperial control, and that they apparently ceased functioning as organized institutions during the Roman period, though the specific timing and processes of their disappearance remain uncertain. Beyond these basic conclusions, claims about specific Druidic beliefs, ritual practices, organizational structures, or relationships to particular sites require acknowledging the speculative nature of reconstructions based on limited evidence. The recognition of these limitations should not diminish appreciation for the historical significance of Druids within their original contexts, or for the remarkable cultural legacy they have generated through successive reinterpretations and reimaginings over more than 2 millennia. The story of Druids in England thus encompasses multiple overlapping narratives, including the historical reality of Iron Age religious specialists operating within late prehistoric Celtic societies, the Roman construction of Druids as exotic and dangerous others, requiring suppression, the medieval preservation of classical knowledge about Druids within Christian frameworks, the early modern antiquarian attribution of prehistoric monuments to Druids, the romantic transformation of Druids into symbols of ancient wisdom and national identity, the Victorian struggle between archaeological evidence and cherished theories, the modern creation of Druidic spiritual traditions, and contemporary scholarly attempts to understand both ancient realities and subsequent cultural constructions. Each generation has approached Druids through the particular concerns and cultural frameworks of its time, creating interpretations that tell us as much about the interpreters as about ancient realities. The continuing fascination with Druids reflects enduring human interests in questions about the relationship between religion and power, the transmission of traditional knowledge, the experience of the sacred in natural settings, and the connections between contemporary identity and the distant past. The Druids of classical texts, the Druids of romantic imagination, and the Druids of modern spiritual practice represent distinct phenomena that should not be conflated, even as their complex relationships and mutual influences require acknowledgement. The scholarly project of understanding ancient Druids proceeds through careful analysis of limited evidence, while recognizing that many questions cannot be answered with confidence from available materials. The cultural project of engaging with Druidic legacy operates in multiple registers, including heritage management, spiritual practice, literary creation, and popular culture, each with its own values and appropriate methods. The recognition that these different approaches to Druids serve different purposes and answer to different authorities enables more sophisticated understanding of why Druids remain culturally significant more than 2,000 years after. The Roman conquest eliminated them as functioning institutions. The ancient Druids themselves, about whom so little can be known with certainty, have generated cultural legacies far exceeding what any Iron Age religious specialists could have anticipated, becoming symbols that diverse communities continue investing with meanings, reflecting contemporary aspirations, anxieties, and imaginations about human relationships, with the sacred, with nature, and with the mysterious past that shaped the present. The development of Celtic studies as a formal academic discipline during the 19th and 20th centuries created institutional frameworks within which questions about Druids could be investigated through systematic analysis of linguistic, literary, and archaeological evidence, rather than through the speculative antiquarianism that had characterized earlier approaches. The establishment of chairs in Celtic languages at universities including Oxford, Cambridge, and various Scottish and Welsh institutions provided positions for scholars who could undertake rigorous philological analysis of medieval Celtic texts preserved in Irish, Welsh, Scottish, Gaelic, and Breton manuscripts. The linguistic reconstruction of Proto-Celtic and the tracing of cognate terms across the various Celtic language families enabled scholars to identify shared vocabulary relating to religious concepts, social organization, and material culture that might illuminate pre-Christian Celtic societies. The analysis of Old Irish legal texts, including the Brehon Laws, which were compiled in written form during the early medieval period, but purported to preserve much older customary legal traditions, provided potential comparative evidence for understanding the legal functions that classical sources attributed to Druids in Gaul and Britain. The Irish medieval literature preserving myths, sagas, and hagiographical accounts that featured Druids as characters interacting with heroes, saints, and kings offered rich but problematic materials for reconstructing pre-Christian Irish religion and potentially drawing inferences about British Druidic traditions through comparative analysis. The scholarly debates about the extent to which these Irish texts preserve genuine pre-Christian materials versus representing medieval literary creations that projected Christian concepts and narrative structures onto pagan settings reflected broader methodological tensions within Celtic studies about the reliability of late sources for understanding earlier periods. The analysis of Welsh medieval texts, including the Mabinogion tales, the poetry attributed to early Welsh bards like Taliesin and Aneurin, and the historical and legal materials preserved in medieval Welsh manuscripts provided additional comparative evidence for Celtic cultural traditions that might illuminate aspects of pre-Christian British society. The recognition that Ireland had never been conquered by Rome, and thus potentially preserved Celtic cultural and linguistic traditions with less disruption than occurred in Romanized Britain, created theoretical frameworks suggesting Irish materials might provide better evidence for understanding ancient Celtic societies than British sources, though this assumption required critical examination given the extensive Christianization of Ireland and the medieval dating of surviving texts. The comparative analysis of Celtic place names across Britain, Ireland, and continental European regions where Celtic languages had been spoken revealed patterns in how Celtic-speaking populations named landscape features, settlements, and sacred sites, providing evidence for religious concepts and practices encoded in toponymy. The identification of place name elements, potentially relating to deities, sacred groves, ritual sites, and other religiously significant locations, created databases of evidence that could be analyzed for patterns suggesting the geographical distribution and characteristics of Celtic religious practices. The interdisciplinary collaboration between linguists, archaeologists, and historians during the 20th century enabled more sophisticated approaches to questions about Druids and Celtic religion than had been possible when these disciplines operated in isolation from one another. The specific archaeological investigations at sites across the Celtic-speaking regions of the British Isles during the 20th and 21st centuries produced detailed evidence for Iron Age societies, while continuing to face challenges in definitively identifying religious practices and practitioners from material remains. The excavations at Danebury Hill Fort in Hampshire, conducted over decades, beginning in the 1960s by Barry Cunliffe, and his team produced comprehensive evidence for Iron Age settlement organization, agricultural practices, craft production, and ritual activities, including unusual deposits of animal and human remains in storage pits. The analysis of these deposits revealed patterns suggesting ritual disposal of materials rather than simple waste management, with particular attention to articulated animal skeletons, partial human burials, and artifacts placed in ways that seemed deliberately structured rather than randomly discarded. The interpretation of these finds generated scholarly debates about whether they represented sacrifice, ritual feasting, foundation deposits, or other religious practices, with recognition that multiple explanations might apply to different deposits and that ancient motivations often remain opaque to archaeological analysis. The discovery of the Gundestrup cauldron in Denmark, though dating to the late Iron Age and originating from somewhere in the Celtic world, rather than from Britain specifically, provided remarkable iconographic evidence for Celtic religious imagery, including figures that some scholars interpreted as possible representations of Druids or other religious practitioners. The silver panels depicting scenes, including a figure seated cross-legged, surrounded by animals, another figure, apparently drowning warriors in a vessel, and various processions and ritual activities offered visual evidence for religious practices that could be compared with classical textual descriptions, though the specific identification of depicted figures and the interpretation of scenes remained subjects of scholarly disagreement. The archaeological investigation of ritual shafts or deep pits at various British Iron Age sites, including one at Holzhausen in Bavaria that reached over 100 feet in depth and contained wooden structures, animal remains, and other deposits, raised questions about their purposes and the cosmological beliefs that would have motivated such extraordinary construction efforts. The discovery of wooden figures and structures preserved in waterlogged conditions at sites including the source of the River Seine in France, where hundreds of wooden votive offerings, including representations of human figures and body parts, were deposited during the Iron Age and Roman periods, provided rare evidence for the use of wood in Celtic religious practices that normally does not survive in the archaeological record. The recognition that wood would have been a primary material for constructing religious structures, creating cult images, and producing various ritual objects in ancient Britain means that the archaeological record preserves only a fraction of the material culture associated with Celtic religion, with most wooden artifacts having decayed completely except in unusual preservation conditions. The theoretical developments within archaeology during the late 20th century influenced how scholars approached questions about religious practices and belief systems in prehistoric societies, including Iron Age Britain. The recognition that religion permeates all aspects of ancient societies, rather than being confined to distinct sacred spaces or specialized practitioners, encouraged archaeologists to consider the religious dimensions of domestic life, agricultural practices, craft production, and political activities, rather than focusing exclusively on clearly ritual contexts. The application of landscape archaeology approaches examining how ancient populations understood, used, and attributed meaning to their environments, created frameworks for investigating sacred geographies and the relationships between natural features, constructed monuments, and patterns of settlement and movement. The analysis of visibility and intervisibility between monuments, settlements, and landscape features using geographic information systems, technology enabled investigation of how Iron Age populations might have experienced and conceptualized their landscapes, including the positioning of religious sites relative to other landscape elements. The phenomenological approaches in archaeology, encouraging scholars to consider embodied experiences of ancient places through activities like walking, ancient pathways, or experiencing monuments at different times of day and different seasons, provided complementary methods for understanding how sacred sites might have been encountered and used by ancient populations. The feminist critiques of archaeological interpretation, highlighting how assumptions about gender had influenced reconstructions of ancient societies, encouraged reconsideration of whether Druids were exclusively male as classical sources, suggested or whether women might have served as religious specialists in ways that Roman authors failed to document or deliberately obscured. The analysis of unusual burials, including the Wetwang chariot burial that contained the remains of a woman buried with a chariot, weapons, and other high-status grave goods, raised questions about women's roles in Iron Age British society and the possibility that some women held positions of religious or political authority that classical sources did not acknowledge. The recognition that Roman authors wrote from patriarchal perspectives that might have caused them to ignore or minimize women's religious roles created space for alternative interpretations of archaeological evidence suggesting more diverse and complex gender configurations in Celtic religious institutions than classical texts indicated. The comparative analysis of Celtic societies across the regions of continental Europe, Britain, and Ireland where Celtic languages were spoken revealed both common features, suggesting shared cultural traditions and significant regional variations reflecting local developments and external influences. The investigation of the Hallstatt culture of Central Europe during the early Iron Age and the subsequent Latin culture that spread across much of temperate Europe provided archaeological frameworks for understanding the development and depunces spread of Celtic material culture. The rich burials discovered at sites like Hochstorf in Germany and Vix in France, containing imported Mediterranean luxury goods, alongside locally produced metalwork of extraordinary quality, demonstrated the wealth and international connections of Celtic elites during the late Hallstatt and early Latin periods. The question of whether cultural similarities observable in the archaeological record across regions occupied by Celtic-speaking populations reflected shared religious beliefs and institutions, or merely similar material cultures, produced by societies with diverse local traditions, remained debated among scholars. The classical references to Druids in Gaul providing more detailed information than sources discussing British Druids raised questions about whether Gaulish and British Druidic institutions were organized similarly, or whether regional variations existed in how religious specialists functioned within different Celtic societies. The specific claim by Caesar that Druids gathered annually at a central location in Gaul, but without parallel references to similar gatherings in Britain, suggested possible organizational differences between Gaulish and British Druidic traditions. The archaeological evidence for major tribal oppida, or urban centers developing in Gaul during the late Iron Age, including sites like Bibract that served as political and economic centers for large tribal confederations, contrasted with the less urbanized character of late Iron Age Britain, where hill forts and dispersed settlements remained the dominant settlement pattern. The question of how these different settlement patterns and degrees of political centralization might have influenced religious institutions, including the organization and authority of Druids, required consideration of the relationships between religious and political structures in Iron Age societies. The Roman conquest of Gaul, completed by Caesar in the 50s, before the Common Era preceded the conquest of Britain by nearly a century, creating different timelines for the disruption and transformation of indigenous religious institutions in the two regions. The specific evidence from sites in Wales, Scotland, and Cornwall, where Celtic linguistic and cultural traditions persisted longer than in regions that became more thoroughly Anglicized, provides important contexts for understanding the regional dimensions of British Celtic culture and the possible survival of religious traditions with longer continuities to the pre-Roman past. The archaeological investigation of Iron Age sites in Wales, including the hill fort at Tre Seri in Gwynedd, with its remarkably preserved stone-built roundhouse foundations, and the ritual site at Llyn Cerrig Bach on Anglesey, where numerous high-quality metalwork objects were deposited in a lake during the late Iron Age, provided evidence for Welsh Iron Age societies and their religious practices. The Llyn Cerrig Bach assemblage, including swords, spears, chariot fittings, slave chains, and other objects spanning approximately 2 centuries of deposition during the late Iron Age, represented one of the most significant collections of Iron Age metalwork from Britain, and raised questions about the nature of the site and the reasons for these depositions. The location on Anglesey, which classical sources identified as a major centre of Druidic activity, encouraged speculation about whether these deposits related to Druidic rituals, though definitive connections remained impossible to establish. The continuing importance of Anglesey in Welsh tradition and its role in medieval Welsh political and cultural life suggested long continuities in the island's significance that might extend back to pre-Roman periods. The archaeological evidence from Scotland, including the distinctive brocks or stone towers concentrated in northern Scotland, the crannogs, or artificial islands used for settlement in Scottish lochs, and the various hill forts and other Iron Age sites documented throughout the country, provided evidence for sophisticated Iron Age societies in regions that remained outside Roman control. The absence of direct Roman conquest in much of Scotland and the maintenance of Celtic languages in Scottish Gaelic-speaking regions into the modern period created potential for longer cultural continuities that might preserve elements of pre-Christian traditions. Though the Christianization of Scotland during the first millennium of the Common Era and the extensive cultural changes accompanying later medieval developments meant that any such continuities would have been heavily transformed. The archaeological investigation of sites like Dunad in Argyll, which served as a major political centre for the Kingdom of Dal Riata during the early medieval period, and contained carved footprints and other features suggesting royal inauguration rituals, raised questions about the possible pre-Christian origins of ritual practices that continued in Christian contexts. The analysis of early medieval sculptured stones from Scotland, including the symbol stones bearing enigmatic carved designs, whose meanings remain uncertain, and the later Christian cross slabs combining Christian imagery with what some scholars interpret as pre-Christian artistic motifs, provided potential evidence for cultural transitions and the incorporation of earlier traditions into Christian frameworks. The development of scientific dating techniques, including radiocarbon dating, dendrochronology, and various other methods for establishing absolute chronologies, revolutionized prehistoric archaeology during the second half of the 20th century by providing frameworks for dating sites and artifacts independently of typological comparisons or historical assumptions. The application of radiocarbon dating to British prehistoric monuments produced revelations, including the demonstration that Stonehenge and other megalithic structures dated to the Neolithic period, thousands of years before the Iron Age, when Druids could plausibly have been active, definitively disproving the antiquarian theories that had attributed these monuments to Druids. The radiocarbon dating of the Lindow-Man bog body to the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era placed this find within the period when Druids were known to have been active in Britain, making the interpretation of this as a possible case of Druidic human sacrifice more plausible than would have been the case with an earlier or later date. The development of stable isotope analysis, enabling reconstruction of ancient diets and movement patterns through analysis of chemical signatures in human bone and teeth, provided new methods for investigating Iron Age populations, including the origins of individuals found in unusual burials who might have been religious specialists or sacrificial victims. The application of these techniques to the Lindow-Man remains revealed that he had consumed a diet relatively high in protein and low in marine foods, suggesting an inland origin, and that his final meal had been unusual in composition, potentially supporting interpretations of ritual significance. The advances in ancient DNA analysis during the late 20th and early 21st centuries created possibilities for investigating population movements, biological relationships between individuals, and other questions that traditional archaeological methods could not address. The extraction and analysis of DNA from Iron Age human remains provided evidence for the biological relationships between British Iron Age populations and both earlier Neolithic inhabitants and later Anglo-Saxon migrants, contributing to debates about the scale and nature of population changes during the late Iron Age and post-Roman periods. The recognition that Iron Age British populations showed genetic continuity with earlier Neolithic populations, while also incorporating genes from continental European populations, suggested complex patterns of migration and admixture, rather than simple replacement of populations by invaders. The investigation of the relationship between Druids and other categories of religious specialists, mentioned in classical sources, including the Vates or seers, and the bards or poets, who preserved traditional knowledge through memorized compositions, raised questions about how religious authority and functions were distributed within Celtic societies. The classical descriptions suggesting these represented distinct but related categories of specialists, rather than simply different names for the same people, implied social differentiation and specialized functions within the broader category of traditional knowledge keepers. The survival of bardic traditions in Wales and Ireland into the medieval period and beyond, with extensive literary evidence for the training, social status, and functions of bards in these societies, provided potential comparative evidence for understanding how oral traditions and specialized learning were maintained and transmitted in Celtic societies. The analysis of medieval Welsh bardic poetry, including the work attributed to early poets like Taliesin and Aneurin, raised questions about the extent to which these represented genuine compositions from the 6th century or later, medieval creations attributed to legendary figures, with implications for using these materials as evidence for early Celtic oral traditions. The examination of the bardic training systems described in Irish and Welsh sources, which involved years of study, learning vast repertoires of traditional materials, including genealogies, laws, historical narratives, and poetic forms, suggested the pedagogical methods that might have been employed in training Druids, as described in classical sources. The social status of bards in medieval Celtic societies, which involved relationships with royal and aristocratic patrons who provided support in exchange for praise, poetry, and maintenance of genealogical legitimacy, suggested possible models for how Druids might have been integrated into Iron Age political structures. The question of whether medieval bardic institutions preserved continuities from pre-Christian Druidic traditions or represented new forms that emerged in Christian Celtic societies remained debated, with scholars taking various positions based on their assessments of the evidence for cultural continuity versus transformation during the early medieval period. The analysis of ritual landscape features, including sacred groves, springs, rivers, and other natural sites that classical sources described as important in Celtic religion, provided frameworks for understanding how pre-Christian populations conceptualized sacred geography and conducted religious practices in natural sandig settings, rather than exclusively in constructed temples or monuments. The references in classical sources, including particularly Lucan's vivid descriptions of sacred groves as terrifying places filled with crude altars, dark pools, and blood-spattered trees, suggested that natural woodland settings played central roles in Celtic religious practices. The archaeological investigation of potential sacred groves presents severe methodological challenges, given that ritual activities in woodland settings typically leave minimal material traces, and that the identification of ancient woodland locations requires paleo-environmental evidence that is often unavailable. The analysis of pollen cores from bogs and lakes, enabling reconstruction of past vegetation patterns, has provided evidence for woodland clearance and management in prehistoric Britain, but cannot typically identify specific locations as sacred groves versus ordinary woodland. The discovery of wooden structures and objects in waterlogged deposits at some sites, including the various wooden figures found at the sources of rivers in Gaul, has provided evidence for ritual activities involving wooden constructions in wet contexts. Though the extension of these findings to understanding sacred groves in Britain remains speculative. The continuing importance of sacred springs and healing wells in British folk tradition into the modern period, with many of these sites having been Christianized through association with saints, but retaining pre-Christian elements in their cults, suggested possible continuities with Iron Age veneration of water sources. The archaeological investigation of springs and wells has revealed evidence for ritual deposits, including metalwork and other valuable objects at various locations, though dating these deposits and determining whether they relate to pre-Roman practices or later activities remains challenging. The place name evidence, preserving elements potentially relating to sacred groves, including names incorporating terms for woodland, combined with words suggesting religious significance, has been analyzed to map possible locations of sacred sites. Though the dating of place name formation remains uncertain, and many names may reflect medieval rather than Iron Age designations. The influence of Druidic imagery and themes in British literature from the medieval period through contemporary times reflects the continuing cultural resonance of these figures and the ways successive literary movements and individual authors have adapted Druidic materials for various artistic purposes. The incorporation of prophetic and magical figures into medieval Arthurian romances, while not explicitly identified as Druids in most cases, drew on traditions about Celtic learned men who possessed supernatural knowledge and served as advisors to kings, creating literary types that bore resemblances to Druidic figures described in classical sources. The character of Merlin, as developed through Geoffrey of Monmouth's writings and subsequent Arthurian literature, combined elements including prophetic abilities derived from ambiguous parentage involving supernatural beings, knowledge of natural magic enabling transformations and illusions, advisory roles to King Arthur and other rulers, and eventual retirement to a sacred forest, creating an enduringly influential literary figure whose characteristics overlapped significantly with classical descriptions of Druidic functions and powers. The question of whether the Merlin figure preserved genuine traditions about pre-Christian Celtic religious specialists or represented entirely medieval literary creation remained debated among scholars of medieval literature. The Renaissance and early modern periods witnessed renewed literary interest in Druids, as classical texts became more widely available, and antiquarian investigations of British history increased awareness of pre-Roman British culture. The poet Michael Drayton incorporated references to Druids into his topographical poem, Polyolbion, published in the early 17th century, presenting them as ancient British priests who had conducted ceremonies in sacred groves and possessed knowledge of natural philosophy. The development of national epic poetry during the 18th century encouraged poets to seek British historical materials comparable to the classical epics of Greece and Rome, leading some writers to imagine Druids as potential subjects for heroic treatment. William Mason's dramatic poem, Caractacus, published in 1759, featured Druids as characters supporting British resistance to Roman conquest, presenting them as patriotic defenders of national independence and ancient religion against foreign imperialism. The Romantic poets, including William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and William Blake, incorporated Druidic references into various works, though their treatments reflected more general, romantic interests in the sublime, the ancient, and the mysterious, rather than specific historical reconstructions. The Victorian period witnessed extensive use of Druidic themes in popular literature, including historical novels set in ancient Britain that featured Druids as central characters, representing ancient British culture confronting Roman conquest. The novelist Edward Bulwer Lytton wrote extensively about Druids in works including his novel The Last of the Barons, presenting them as repositories of ancient wisdom and practitioners of natural magic, whose knowledge derived from profound understanding of occult natural forces. The development of fantasy literature during the late 19th and 20th centuries created new contexts for literary deployments of Druidic figures, with Druids appearing as character types in fantasy worlds, inspired by but not directly representing historical Britain. The intersection of Druidic studies with questions of national identity, Celtic nationalism, and the politics of cultural heritage during the 19th and 20th centuries created contentious debates about the appropriate uses of historical and archaeological evidence for contemporary political purposes. The Welsh cultural revival movement of the 18th and 19th centuries deployed Druidic imagery and claims about continuous bardic traditions as resources for asserting Welsh cultural distinctiveness and challenging English cultural and political dominance. The establishment of the Gorsid ceremonies associated with the national Eisteddfod, despite their origins in Iolo Morgantweg's forgeries and inventions, successfully created powerful symbols of Welsh cultural identity that continue functioning as important elements of contemporary Welsh national culture. The debates about the authenticity of Iolo Morgantweg's materials, which intensified as scholars demonstrated the fraudulent nature of many documents he claimed were medieval, created tensions between historical accuracy and the cultural and political functions these traditions served for Welsh communities. The recognition that invented traditions could become genuinely meaningful elements of cultural identity regardless of their dubious historical origins, raised broader questions about the relationships between historical accuracy, cultural authenticity, and the uses of the past in constructing national identities. The Scottish cultural revival and the broader Celtic revival movement, encompassing Ireland, Wales, Scotland, Cornwall, and Brittany, drew on romantic images of Celtic peoples as preserving ancient traditions, intimate connections with nature, and cultural characteristics, distinguishing them from Anglo-Saxon or Norman populations. The political dimensions of Celtic revivalism, including support for Home Rule in Ireland, devolution movements in Scotland and Wales, and broader critiques of British imperialism, meant that debates about Druids and Celtic history often carried contemporary political implications that extended beyond academic questions about the past. The English responses to Celtic cultural nationalism sometimes involved counterclaims about Anglo-Saxon traditions and institutions as equally ancient and legitimate, creating competing narratives about national origins and historical legitimacy. The archaeological investigations at Anglo-Saxon sites, including the discovery of the Sutton Hoo ship burial in 1939, provided evidence for the sophistication and wealth of early English kingdoms, contributing to narratives about English historical development that offered alternatives to Celtic-focused histories. The heritage industry that developed during the late 20th and early 21st centuries around ancient monuments and archaeological sites, including those associated with Druids in popular imagination, created economic and cultural infrastructure that both depends upon and reinforces popular interest in ancient British history. The management of major sites, including Stonehenge, by English Heritage and the National Trust, involves balancing multiple competing interests, including archaeological conservation, public access, educational programming, tourism revenue, and accommodation of modern spiritual practitioners who regard these sites as sacred. The visitor centers, interpretive displays, and educational programs developed at these sites attempt to provide accurate historical and archaeological information while also creating engaging experiences that attract the large numbers of visitors necessary to justify conservation. Expenditures. The archaeological research conducted at Stonehenge and other major sites continues producing new discoveries and interpretations, including the Stonehenge Riverside Project investigations that proposed new theories about the monument's purposes and its relationships to nearby Neolithic sites, including Durrington Walls. The discoveries of previously unknown henges and other monuments through aerial photography, LiDAR surveys, and other remote sensing technologies continue expanding knowledge about the prehistoric landscapes surrounding famous monuments, while raising questions about how this new information should be incorporated into site presentations and public understanding. The debates about reconstruction and presentation of archaeological sites, including questions about whether structures should be reconstructed based on archaeological evidence or left as ruins that honestly represent their current condition, reflect broader philosophical questions about heritage management and the purposes of preserving the past. The seasonal celebrations conducted at ancient sites by modern Druids and other pagans have become significant events, attracting media coverage and contributing to public awareness of both the sites and the modern religious movements using them. Though these events also raise concerns about site damage from large numbers of visitors and the potential conflicts between conservation and access. The negotiations between site managers, modern religious practitioners, local communities, and other stakeholders about appropriate uses of ancient monuments exemplify the complex challenges of heritage management in democratic societies, with diverse populations holding different values and relationships to the past. The international dimensions of interest in Druids and Celtic culture reflect the global reach of British imperial power and cultural influence, as well as the development of academic disciplines and popular cultural forms that transcend national boundaries. The export of antiquarian and archaeological knowledge about British prehistory through publications, museum exhibitions, and educational exchanges created awareness of Druids and Celtic Britain in scholarly communities throughout Europe and North America. The migration of Celtic populations from Britain and Ireland to North America, Australia, and other destinations during the 19th and 20th centuries carried traditions, cultural identities, and historical narratives about Celtic origins, including materials about Druids to diaspora communities. The development of Celtic cultural organizations in North American cities, including societies promoting Irish, Scottish, and Welsh cultural heritage, created contexts where Druidic imagery and narratives about ancient Celtic civilization could function as resources for ethnic identity formation among immigrant communities. The academic study of Celtic languages, literatures, and histories in North American and European universities established institutional bases for Celtic studies outside Britain and Ireland, while creating international networks of scholars contributing to debates about Druids and other aspects of Celtic culture. The global reach of English-language popular culture, including literature, films, and more recently digital media, ensured that British historical narratives and legendary materials, including Druidic themes, reached worldwide audiences. The fantasy literature genre developing through the 20th century and becoming globally popular drew extensively on Celtic mythological materials and historical settings, including frequent incorporation of Druidic figures as character, types representing ancient wisdom, natural magic, and connections to primal forces. The role-playing games, video games, and other interactive entertainment media incorporating Druidic character classes and themes extended Druidic imagery into new cultural forms, reaching particularly young audiences and shaping how contemporary generations imagine ancient religious specialists. The academic conferences, publications, and professional organizations devoted to Celtic studies created international forums where scholars from various countries and disciplines could share research and debate interpretations of evidence relating to Druids and other aspects of Sunk and Celtic culture. The development of heritage tourism as a significant economic sector created incentives for promoting sites associated with Celtic and Druidic history to international visitors, with tourism marketing materials often emphasizing romantic and mysterious aspects of ancient sites, rather than the more prosaic realities documented by archaeological research. The designation of major prehistoric monuments, including Stonehenge, as UNESCO World Heritage Sites, reflected international recognition of their significance, while also creating obligations for their preservation and management, according to international standards. The digital revolution and the development of internet technologies during the late 20th and early 21st centuries transformed how information about Druids circulates, how communities of interest form and interact, and how scholarly research can be conducted and disseminated. The creation of online databases containing archaeological reports, historical texts, and other scholarly materials enabled researchers to access information that previously required travel to physical archives or libraries, facilitating new forms of comparative analysis and synthesis. The digitization of classical texts, including all the major sources describing Druids, made these materials freely available online through projects like Perseus Digital Library, enabling anyone with internet access to read Caesar, Tacitus, Strabo, and other ancient authors, regardless of their proximity to academic libraries. The development of online archaeological databases documenting excavations, finds, and sites throughout Britain created resources enabling researchers to search for patterns and connections across large datasets that would have been impractical to analyze using traditional methods. The application of geographic information systems and spatial analysis techniques to archaeological data enabled investigation of relationships between sites, monuments, and landscape features that could illuminate questions about how Iron Age populations organized their territories and located religious sites. The use of three-dimensional modeling and virtual reconstruction techniques allowed creation of visualizations showing how ancient monuments might have appeared in their original contexts, though these reconstructions remained hypothetical and dependent on interpretive decisions about missing information. The proliferation of websites, blogs, online forums, and social media platforms created new venues where both scholarly and popular discussions about Druids could occur, enabling formation of online communities, uniting individuals with shared interests regardless of geographic separation. The modern Druidic organizations established online presences, providing information about their beliefs and practices, while also using digital technologies for communication among members, coordination of activities, and recruitment of new participants. The challenges of evaluating information quality and reliability in online environments, where scholarly research, amateur speculation, and deliberate misinformation coexist without clear markers of authority or credibility, created new problems for public understanding of historical topics, including Druids. The viral spread of images, claims, and narratives through social media platforms enabled rapid dissemination of both accurate information and misconceptions about Druids and ancient Britain, with sensational or emotionally resonant content often circulating more widely than careful scholarly analysis. The methodological advances in archaeological science, including various forms of chemical analysis, microscopy, experimental archaeology, and computational modeling, created new approaches to investigating ancient materials and inferring past practices from physical evidence. The application of use-wear analysis to stone and metal tools from Iron Age contexts enabled reconstruction of how these implements had been employed, providing evidence for craft activities, agricultural practices, and other aspects of daily life in the societies where Druids operated. The analysis of residues preserved on pottery vessels, using techniques including gas chromatography and mass spectrometry, revealed information about the contents of these containers, including evidence for particular foods, beverages, or other substances that might relate to ritual practices or daily subsistence. The examination of textile fragments preserved in privileged contexts using microscopic analysis provided information about Iron Age clothing, weaving techniques, and the use of dyes, contributing to understanding of material culture and social display. The experimental archaeology involving attempts to replicate ancient technologies, including metalworking, pottery production, and construction techniques, generated practical knowledge about the skills, resources, and labor required for various activities, enabling more informed interpretations of archaeological evidence. The experimental construction of roundhouses using techniques and materials available in the Iron Age provided insights into structural engineering, thermal properties, and the spatial organization of domestic life, while also creating venues for public engagement with ancient history through living history presentations. The attempts to recreate ancient agricultural practices, including cultivation of heritage, grain varieties, using reconstructed tools and methods, contributed to understanding the productivity, labor requirements, and seasonal rhythms of Iron Age farming. The experimental replication of metalworking processes, including bronze casting and iron forging, demonstrated the technical knowledge and practical skills required for producing the weapons, tools, and ornaments found in Iron Age archaeological contexts. The recognition that ancient craftspeople possessed sophisticated empirical knowledge about material properties, heat treatment, and manufacturing processes that had been developed through generations of practical experience encouraged respect for Iron Age technological capabilities, rather than dismissing ancient populations as primitive. The contemporary academic debates about Druids reflect ongoing tensions between different theoretical approaches, interpretive frameworks, and standards of evidence within archaeology and ancient history. The post-processual critiques of earlier archaeological approaches that had emphasized economic and environmental explanations for cultural change encouraged renewed attention to religious and symbolic dimensions of ancient societies, including consideration of how belief systems shaped material practices and social organization. The recognition that religion cannot be neatly separated from other aspects of ancient life encouraged more holistic approaches, examining how religious concepts and practices permeated politics, economics, kinship systems, and daily activities. The feminist and gender-focused scholarship, challenging assumptions that religious authority was exclusively male, opened possibilities for identifying women as potential religious specialists in Iron Age British societies, despite classical sources focusing primarily on male Druids. The post-colonial critiques of how ancient histories have been constructed highlighted the ways that imperial perspectives and nationalist agendas have influenced interpretations of Celtic societies and their encounters with Roman power. The indigenous archaeology movement, encouraging incorporation of descendant community perspectives and oral traditions into archaeological interpretations, raised questions about whether modern Celtic identifying populations or modern Druids should have particular authority or standing in debates about how Iron Age British religion is understood and presented. The scientific archaeology emphasizing quantitative methods, hypothesis testing, and rigorous standards of evidence for inferring past practices from material remains, sometimes tensions with more interpretive approaches that emphasize the multiple possible meanings of archaeological evidence and the limitations of positivist epistemologies. The debates about the appropriate relationship between academic scholarship and modern religious movements, including questions about whether scholars should maintain objectivity and distance or should acknowledge the legitimate interests of contemporary practitioners. In ancient traditions they claim as precedents, reflect broader questions about the purposes and audiences of historical and archaeological research. The public archaeology movement encouraging engagement between professional archaeologists and diverse publics, including descendant communities, local populations, and interested non-specialists, has created new models for how archaeological knowledge is produced and disseminated, though these approaches also raise questions about expertise, authority, and the risks of popularization compromising scholarly standards. The question of human sacrifice in Iron Age Britain and its possible connection to Druidic practices remains one of the most controversial and difficult issues in studying ancient Celtic religion, requiring careful evaluation of both classical textual claims and ambiguous archaeological evidence. The vivid classical descriptions of human sacrifice, including Caesar's accounts of burning victims in wicker figures, Strabo's references to divination through observing death agonies, and various other Roman claims about Celtic ritual killing must be assessed, recognizing that accusations of human sacrifice commonly appeared in ancient literature, describing foreign peoples, and often served to portray those peoples as barbaric and justify their conquest. The anthropological recognition that human sacrifice has been practiced in various societies throughout history, often serving purposes, including communication with supernatural powers, consecration of important constructions, responses to crises, and reinforcement of social hierarchies, suggest that claims about Celtic human sacrifice cannot be dismissed as simply Roman propaganda. The archaeological evidence, including bog bodies showing signs of violent death, unusual burials containing individuals who died violently or were buried in atypical ways, and various other finds that might indicate ritual killing, provides material evidence that some forms of human sacrifice or ritual execution occurred in Iron Age northwestern Europe. The Lindo Man remains represent the most extensively studied potential case of human sacrifice from Iron Age Britain, with forensic evidence indicating multiple methods of killing, deposition in a bog that may have held sacred significance, and various other features consistent with ritual rather than criminal violence or warfare casualty. The discovery of other bog bodies from various sites across Britain, Ireland, and continental Europe showing similar patterns of violent death and ritual treatment suggests these were not isolated incidents, but reflected broader religious practices operating across Celtic and Germanic cultural regions. The challenge of distinguishing between human sacrifice as religious ritual, execution of criminals or social deviants as punishment, killing of captives taken in warfare, and elimination of political rivals through methods that might have incorporated ritual elements makes confident interpretation of specific cases extremely difficult. The possibility that different categories of ritual killing existed serving distinct purposes, including offerings to gods, foundation sacrifices, scapegoating to avert collective disasters, and disposal of socially dangerous individuals, means that reducing all evidence to a single explanation oversimplifies complex realities. The question of Druids' roles in human sacrifice, if such practices occurred, cannot be definitively resolved from available evidence, though the classical sources consistently attributed responsibility for conducting sacrifices to Druids as the religious specialists who mediated between human and divine realms. The ethical dimensions of how archaeologists and scholars discuss human sacrifice, including concerns about sensationalizing ancient violence, respecting human remains of individuals who may have been killed against their will, and avoiding presentations that reduce ancient peoples to bloodthirsty savages, require careful attention to how evidence is interpreted and presented to public audiences. The material culture of Iron Age Britain, including the artistic traditions, craft production, and patterns of consumption and display, provides contexts for understanding the societies within which Druids functioned and the resources available to support religious specialists and activities. The development of Latin art style, characterized by curvilinear designs, stylized representations of animals and human figures, and sophisticated use of symmetry and repetition, appeared across much of Iron Age Britain during the final centuries before Roman conquest. The analysis of decorated metalwork, including sword scabbards, shields, mirrors, horse harness fittings, and personal ornaments, revealed sophisticated artistic traditions and possible symbolic systems that might relate to religious beliefs or social identities. The question of whether particular motifs or design elements carried religious meanings, including possible representations of deities, supernatural beings, or cosmological concepts, remains difficult to answer definitively, given the absence of explanatory texts and the challenges of inferring meaning from visual imagery alone. The production of these elaborate artistic objects required specialized craftspeople with advanced technical skills and access to raw materials, including various metals, suggesting social structures that could support craft specialists alongside other non-agricultural producers, including religious practitioners. The discovery of hoards containing large numbers of valuable objects buried in the ground and never recovered raises questions about the motivations for these deposits, including possibilities that some represented offerings to supernatural powers rather than simply wealth storage. The patterns of object deposition in rivers, bogs, and other wet places observable across Iron Age Britain and continental Europe suggest ritual practices involving water as sacred medium for communicating with or making offerings to supernatural forces. The analysis of settlement patterns, including the evidence for increasing social differentiation during the late Iron Age, with some sites showing evidence for elite residences containing imported luxury goods, while others remained modest. Farmsteads documents the hierarchical character of societies that could support religious specialists operating outside agricultural production. The evidence for extensive trade networks connecting British Iron Age populations with continental European societies and more distant Mediterranean civilizations demonstrates the integration of these societies into broader economic and cultural systems that would have facilitated exchange of ideas, including religious concepts and practices. The question of astronomical knowledge in Iron Age Britain and the possible role of Druids in maintaining and applying such knowledge connects to long-standing debates about the purposes and builders of prehistoric monuments showing celestial alignments. The recognition that Neolithic monuments, including Stonehenge, incorporated alignments to solar and lunar events, demonstrates that prehistoric British populations possessed observational astronomy, knowledge, and regarded celestial phenomena as sufficiently important to encode in monumental architecture. The question of whether this knowledge persisted through the Bronze Age into the Iron Age when Druids were active cannot be directly resolved from archaeological evidence, though the continuing use and modification of some ancient monuments during the Iron Age suggests these sites retained significance and the knowledge associated with them may have been preserved. The classical sources, mentioning Druidic knowledge of natural philosophy in the heavens, suggest that astronomical observation and understanding of celestial cycles formed part of the knowledge base attributed to Druids. The practical importance of astronomical knowledge for agricultural societies, requiring accurate calendars for timing, planting, and harvesting operations, would have created incentives for maintaining and transmitting such knowledge across generations. The religious significance of celestial bodies, observable in many ancient societies, including association of the sun, moon, and planets with deities or supernatural powers, suggests astronomical knowledge likely had religious, as well as practical dimensions, in Iron Age Britain. The question of whether Druids served as astronomer priests, maintaining calendrical knowledge and conducting ceremonies timed to celestial events, remains plausible based on comparative evidence from other societies, though impossible to prove definitively from available British evidence. The medieval Celtic sources, including Irish texts mentioning Druids' abilities to create weather magic and influence natural forces, suggest associations between religious specialists and control or prediction of natural phenomena, including meteorological and astronomical events. The interpretation of circular structures at some Iron Age sites as possible astronomical observation platforms or calendrical devices remains speculative, without clearer evidence of their functions and the methods by which they might have been used. The legacy of Stonehenge, as the monument most powerfully associated with Druids in popular imagination, illustrates both the persistence of historical misconceptions and the ways that sites accumulate meanings that exceed and sometimes contradict their actual histories. The 18th century antiquarian attributions of Stonehenge to Druids, despite the monument's actual construction thousands of years earlier, created associations that became deeply embedded in popular culture through illustrations, literature, tourism, and eventually film and other mass media. The archaeological demonstration that Stonehenge was built in multiple phases during the Neolithic and Bronze Ages, between approximately 3000 and 1500, before the Common Era, placed the monument's construction far earlier than the Iron Age period when Druids operated, definitively disproving Druidic construction theories. The recognition that Stonehenge had been used and perhaps modified during the Iron Age, when some Roman artifacts and other materials from that period have been found at the site, suggests the monument retained sacred or symbolic significance for late prehistoric populations who would have encountered it as an ancient mystery. The question of whether Iron Age Druids conducted ceremonies at Stonehenge cannot be answered with certainty, though the monument's evident importance and sacred character make it plausible that whatever religious specialists operated in the Stonehenge landscape would have incorporated this impressive structure into their ritual activities. The modern Druidic adoption of Stonehenge as a primary ceremonial venue reflects both the persistence of historical associations created by antiquarians and the monument's powerful presence and suitability for group ceremonies marking seasonal changes. The summer solstice celebrations at Stonehenge that began developing in the 20th century initially involved relatively small numbers of participants, but expanded dramatically from the 1970s onward as counterculture movements and later neo-pagan religions became more visible. The conflicts between celebrants and authorities during the 1980s, when access to the monument was severely restricted, created martyrdom narratives and intensified commitment among some participants, while also encouraging negotiations about managed access. The eventual agreements allowing supervised public access to the stone circle for solstice celebrations represented pragmatic compromises, acknowledging both the monument's significance to contemporary spiritual practitioners and the POOF conservation requirements protecting this internationally important heritage site. The transformation of solstice celebrations from countercultural gatherings into mainstream tourist events, attracting thousands of visitors, including Druids, pagans, tourists, and others drawn by various motivations, illustrates how heritage sites function as contested spaces where multiple communities assert competing claims and meanings. The continuing evolution of modern Druidic movements during the early 21st century reflects broader trends in contemporary spirituality, including increasing emphasis on environmental concerns, individualized spiritual seeking, and incorporation of diverse elements from various traditions, rather than adherence to single orthodox systems. The environmental activism undertaken by some modern Druidic groups, connecting ancient reverence for nature with contemporary concerns about ecological crisis, demonstrates how ancient symbols and identities can be mobilized for addressing present-day challenges. The participation of Druids in protests against road construction, threatening ancient sites, and in broader environmental movements illustrates the political dimensions that can attach to religious identities, claiming connections to pre-industrial relationships with nature. The diversity within contemporary Druidry, including groups emphasizing historical reconstruction based on careful study of evidence, others focusing on personal, spiritual development through nature-based practices, and still others combining Druidic identity with elements from various other religious and philosophical traditions, reflects the individualization and eclecticism characteristic of much contemporary Western spirituality. The online presence of modern Druidic organizations providing teachings, community forums, and virtual ceremonies has expanded access to Druidic identity and practice beyond those who can physically attend gatherings or ceremonies at ancient sites. The development of Druidic training programs, offering structured curricula, covering topics including Celtic history and mythology, tree lore, astronomy, poetry, and ritual practice, demonstrates the creation of systematic educational frameworks for transmitting Druidic knowledge, adapted to contemporary learning styles and technologies. The question of gender equality in modern Druidry contrasts with the male focus of classical sources about ancient Druids, with most contemporary Druidic organizations explicitly welcoming both men and women as full participants, and many having women in leadership positions. The incorporation of elements from other religious and spiritual traditions, including goddess spirituality, shamanism, Eastern philosophies, and various forms of magic and divination into some forms of contemporary Druidry, illustrates the syncretic and creative nature of modern religious innovation. The future of Druidic studies in both academic and popular contexts will likely continue reflecting tensions between evidence-based historical research and various contemporary uses of Druidic imagery and identity for spiritual, political, and cultural purposes. The archaeological investigation of Iron Age Britain will continue producing new evidence as excavations employ increasingly sophisticated techniques and analytical methods, while sites management involves ongoing conservation challenges and negotiations about public access. The application of emerging technologies, including advanced DNA analysis, isotopic studies, and various other scientific techniques to existing collections of Iron Age materials, may reveal new information about ancient populations and their practices that current methods cannot detect. The continued debates within academia about appropriate methodologies for studying ancient religion and about the relationships between scholarly expertise and descendant community interests will shape how Druids are understood, presented in academic contexts. The heritage management challenges associated with ancient sites, including balancing conservation requirements against public access demands and accommodating diverse stakeholder interests, will require ongoing negotiation and adaptation. Visitation patterns change, and new uses emerge. The modern Druidic movements will likely continue evolving as new generations adapt traditions to contemporary concerns, while maintaining continuity with earlier forms through institutional structures and transmitted practices, regardless of their relationships to ancient historical realities. The popular culture representations of Druids in literature, film, games, and other media will continue shaping how broad audiences imagine these ancient figures, while scholarly efforts to provide accurate information compete with more dramatic fictional portrayals. The question of how society should relate to ancient pasts, including determining appropriate uses of heritage sites, resolving conflicting claims between different communities, and balancing historical accuracy against other values, will remain contentious, as diverse populations with different stakes in these questions assert their perspectives. The recognition that Druids function simultaneously as historical subjects about whom limited evidence exists, as powerful symbols deployed for various purposes, and as identities claimed by contemporary religious practitioners, requires sophisticated understanding of the multiple dimensions of these figures and their legacies across more than 2 millennia of recorded history and cultural memory.